The region known historically as southern Mesopotamia, situated between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, represents one of the earliest centers of human urban development. Archaeological evidence indicates that by the Ubaid period, beginning around 6000 BCE, sedentary farming communities had established extensive irrigation networks to manage the seasonal flooding of the rivers. These early systems included canals, levees, and small reservoirs, demonstrating both engineering ingenuity and cooperative labor organization. The productivity enabled by irrigation agriculture produced food surpluses, which in turn supported population growth and the emergence of proto-urban settlements. Records from later periods, including administrative tablets from the Uruk and Jemdet Nasr phases, suggest that the organization of labor around irrigation was closely linked to emerging temple-centered governance, indicating a structural integration of economy and religious authority. This relationship between environmental management and social complexity constitutes an early example of how geography directly influenced political and economic structures. Settlements during this period, such as Eridu, Tel al-Abaid, and later Uruk, display continuity in material culture, including standardized pottery styles and mud brick construction. Archaeologists uncovered substantial temple platforms, some exceeding 20 meters in height, implying the central role of religious institutions in early urban life. Temples not only served ceremonial purposes but also functioned as administrative hubs, storing surplus grain, regulating trade, and managing labor. This duality of religious and economic function reflects an early integration of ideological and practical authority, providing insight into the mechanisms by which proto-states maintained cohesion and stability. The spatial arrangement of these settlements, with monumental architecture centrally located, supports the interpretation that emerging elites exercised influence through both ritual leadership and control of productive resources. Agriculture in southern Mesopotamia during the Ubaid period relied primarily on the cultivation of barley and emmer wheat, supplemented by legumes, dates, and various domesticated animals, including sheep, goats, and cattle. Archaeobotanical studies indicate the presence of irrigation canals that extended several kilometers from the main river channels, allowing cultivation in areas that would otherwise have been arid. This intensive land use required careful planning and coordination, which likely contributed to the formation of hierarchical social structures. Analytical observations suggest that the need to organize labor for large-scale irrigation projects directly promoted the development of administrative elites, whose authority was justified through both practical necessity and religious sanction. The integration of these systems demonstrates an early model of state formation in which environmental adaptation, technological innovation, and socio-political hierarchy were mutually reinforcing. By the mid-4th millennium BCE, during the Uruk period, settlements had grown substantially in both population and physical size, with some cities covering more than 100 hectares. Archaeological surveys revealed densely packed residential areas alongside monumental complexes, suggesting sophisticated urban planning. Excavations at Uruk, particularly in the Yana district, indicate that civic and religious functions were closely linked, with evidence for centralized storage of surplus commodities and standardized measurement systems. These findings support the interpretation that early urbanism involved not only demographic concentration, but also formal administrative structures capable of regulating resources, labor, and trade. The standardization of weights, measures, and administrative tokens represents an early bureaucratic mechanism, laying the foundation for later developments in record-keeping and writing. Material culture from this period includes the earliest forms of pictographic writing, primarily used for accounting purposes. Clay tokens representing commodities were increasingly replaced by inscribed tablets, forming the precursor to the cuneiform script of later periods. The development of writing reflects an analytical adaptation to the demands of complex economic management, particularly in urban centers where the administration of grain, livestock, and labor required precise record-keeping. The earliest proto-cuneiform tablets, excavated at sites such as Uruk and Jemdet Nasr, document transactions and allocations, providing direct evidence for the mechanisms of early bureaucracy. This transition from tangible tokens to inscribed records demonstrates the interplay between technological innovation and administrative sophistication, highlighting how material necessity can drive intellectual and cultural developments. Social stratification is evident in both architectural and funerary evidence from southern Mesopotamia. Larger and more elaborate dwellings, as well as specialized craft production areas, suggest the presence of occupational differentiation and hierarchical social roles. Administrative texts from subsequent Uruk levels imply that temple officials and emerging elites controlled significant resources and labor forces. Interpretive insights suggest that this early stratification reflects the interdependence of economic, religious, and political authority. The capacity of centralized institutions to mobilize labor for large-scale projects, such as temple construction and canal maintenance, illustrates the early formation of complex societies in which elite authority was institutionalized and legitimized through religious and administrative functions. Environmental factors continued to shape the trajectory of these early communities. Archaeological cores from southern Mesopotamia indicate periods of both intensified flooding and relative aridity, which would have necessitated adaptive strategies for water management and agricultural planning. Records suggest that failures in irrigation maintenance could lead to localized crises, reinforcing the role of coordinated administration. These observations highlight the broader principle that environmental constraints were a primary driver of social and technological innovation. The ability of these communities to sustain dense populations under variable hydrological conditions demonstrates early resilience and organizational capacity, providing a systemic context for understanding subsequent urban and political developments. The combination of environmental adaptation, economic surplus, and centralized religious authority laid the foundation for the emergence of city-states, which would define the political landscape of Sumer in the early dynastic period. Excavations at Eridu, Uar, and Uruk reveal continued elaboration of temple complexes, suggesting that religious institutions were increasingly intertwined with political governance. Interpretive analysis indicates that the early Sumerian city-states represent a model in which urbanization, religious authority, and administrative bureaucracy co-evolved, providing a template for the rise of kingship and codified law in later periods. The material record confirms that these developments were systematic and sustained, rather than isolated or ad hoc. By the end of the 4th millennium BCE, the socio-political and economic structures established in southern Mesopotamia had achieved a level of complexity sufficient to support the emergence of historical kingship. The interplay between irrigated agriculture, urban concentration, and centralized religious institutions created both the necessity and the opportunity for hierarchical leadership. Early kings, recorded in later Sumerian king lists, are presented as intermediaries between the human and divine realms, a characterization that reflects the systemic integration of religious ideology and political authority. Archaeological evidence, including monumental architecture, administrative tablets, and early writing systems, provides empirical support for this model of early civilization formation. In summary, the period between 600 and 3500 BCE in southern Mesopotamia represents a critical phase in the emergence of complex society. The combination of environmental management, agricultural surplus, urbanization, technological innovation, and religiously sanctioned authority created the conditions for the rise of city-states. Analytical observations indicate that these developments were mutually reinforcing. Successful irrigation and agriculture required coordinated labor, which necessitated administrative oversight, which in turn was legitimized through religious structures. This systemic interdependence established a durable foundation upon which later historical and literary developments, including the emergence of the historical Gilgamesh and the literary Epic, would build. By the end of this period, southern Mesopotamia had transformed from dispersed rural settlements into densely populated, administratively organized, and culturally dynamic urban centers, setting the stage for the next phase of Mesopotamian civilization. By the dawn of the 3rd millennium BCE, one city outshone all others, Uruk, the home of Gilgamesh. Archaeological surveys indicate that Uruk had grown into the first major urban center, covering more than 100 hectares and supporting an estimated population of 40,000 to 50,000 individuals at its peak. Excavations revealed densely organized residential districts, alongside monumental public and religious architecture, suggesting a degree of urban planning unprecedented in the ancient Near East. The city's expansion was supported by sophisticated irrigation systems derived from earlier Ubaid innovations, allowing surplus grain production to sustain a large, sedentary population. Such organization indicates the emergence of centralized authority capable of mobilizing labor, allocating resources, and enforcing urban infrastructure projects. Monumental architecture in Uruk provides direct evidence for the integration of religious and political power. The Inanna Precinct, a complex of temples dedicated to the goddess Inanna, exemplifies the dual role of sacred spaces as both ceremonial and administrative centers. Archaeologists uncovered multi-level platforms, large mud brick walls, and evidence of storage facilities, including clay jars and granaries. These structures were not solely ceremonial. They functioned as administrative hubs where temple officials recorded transactions, managed labor forces, and coordinated trade. Interpretive analysis suggests that the centralization of authority around religious institutions provided both ideological legitimacy and practical control, enabling Uruk's rapid growth and its ability to maintain social cohesion over an expanding urban area. Proto-cuneiform writing emerged in Uruk as a critical innovation linked directly to these administrative needs. Clay tablets from the late Uruk period contain early pictographic signs primarily used for accounting, recording quantities of grain, livestock, and labor obligations. Archaeologists discovered over 1,000 such tablets in the Inanna district, demonstrating a highly organized system of record-keeping. This development represents an early form of symbolic abstraction and standardized communication, facilitating complex economic transactions across a densely populated city. Analytical observation indicates that the invention of writing was driven less by literary interest and more by the systemic requirement to administer surplus resources, coordinate labor, and legitimize authority. The political organization of Uruk also exhibits early forms of kingship. The Sumerian king list, compiled in later periods, identifies Gilgamesh as the fifth king of Uruk, ruling approximately in the 27th century BCE. While the historicity of individual rulers in this era remains debated, material and textual evidence suggests that centralized leadership existed to oversee urban administration, trade, and monumental construction. Gilgamesh's inclusion in later lists reflects both historical memory and ideological codification, presenting kingship as a fusion of temporal power and divine sanction. Interpretive insights indicate that this early kingship functioned not merely as personal authority, but as a systemic mechanism for organizing labor, defending the city, and consolidating economic resources, thereby enabling urban growth and social stability. Trade and economic interaction played a pivotal role in Uruk's expansion. Archaeological finds, including imported obsidian, semi-precious stones, and metals, indicate long-distance exchange networks extending across the Iranian plateau and the Levant. Standardized weights and measures discovered at the site suggest the presence of formalized commercial regulation, while distribution of administrative tablets indicates centralized oversight of trade activities. These developments demonstrate how urban centers like Uruk were not isolated settlements but hubs within regional economic systems, integrating agriculture, craft specialization, and exchange. Analytical observation highlights that Uruk's success depended upon its capacity to combine local resource management with coordinated interaction across broader geographic networks. The material culture of Uruk further reflects its social stratification and institutional complexity. Large-scale production of standardized pottery, cylinder seals, and finely crafted tools indicates specialized labor and centralized control of resources. Residential patterns reveal variation in house size and construction quality, implying differentiated social roles and access to wealth. This stratification suggests that political and religious elites were able to exert authority through both control of material resources and ideological legitimization. Archaeological interpretation supports the conclusion that urbanization, monumental architecture, and administrative innovation were mutually reinforcing processes, each contributing to the systemic resilience and expansion of Uruk. By the end of the 4th millennium BCE, Uruk had become a model for subsequent Mesopotamian city-states. Its integration of centralized authority, religious institutions, bureaucratic record-keeping, and economic regulation exemplifies the foundational features of early civilization. The emergence of kingship in this context reflects a broader structural pattern in which urban complexity necessitated hierarchical governance and codified social roles. The inclusion of Gilgamesh in the historical record, whether fully historical or partially mythologized, illustrates how individual leaders became symbolic anchors for these systemic processes, embodying the coordination of labor, administration, and religious sanction. The developments in Uruk set a precedent for the interaction between urbanization and literary culture. The administrative and religious innovations that characterized the city would later provide the environment in which the earliest Sumerian narratives, including the proto-versions of the Gilgamesh stories, could emerge. Records indicate that scribes, operating within temple institutions, began to compose and preserve narrative texts alongside economic and ritual documentation. Analytical insights suggest that the structured, hierarchical, and record-oriented nature of Uruk society created both the means and the motivation for the codification of mythic and historical memory, ultimately laying the groundwork for one of humanity's earliest epics. With cities came kingship, and with kingship, the myths that would define them. Uruk's emergence illustrates how geography, technology, centralized authority, and economic surplus interwove to produce the first major urban civilization in southern Mesopotamia. Archaeological and textual evidence from this period demonstrates the interdependence of environmental adaptation, administrative innovation, and socio-political organization. These systemic developments provided the necessary conditions for the historical Gilgamesh to be remembered, both in official records and in the earliest literary compositions. By the conclusion of the Uruk period, the city had transformed from a regional settlement into a complex urban center whose political and cultural structures would influence all subsequent Mesopotamian civilizations. Sumerian kings were not merely rulers, they were bridges between gods and men. Archaeological and textual evidence from early dynastic Mesopotamia indicates that the office of kingship was conceived as both a political and divine institution. The earliest inscriptions and royal lists suggest that rulers were positioned as intermediaries, responsible for maintaining cosmic and social order. Inscriptions from city-states such as Kish, Uar, and Uruk describe kings overseeing temple construction, administering justice, and leading military campaigns, often with direct reference to divine sanction. This dual authority established a precedent for linking historical leadership with mythic representation, providing a structural foundation for later epic narratives. Among the earliest figures recorded are semi-mythical kings such as Etna of Kish, who, according to Sumerian tradition, ascended to heaven with the assistance of a divine eagle, and Lugalbanda of Uruk, sometimes depicted as a heroic warrior with divine favor. These figures illustrate the synthesis of historical memory and religious ideology. While material evidence for their reigns remains limited, literary texts preserved in later tablets frame them as exemplars of ideal kingship. Archaeologists and philologists note that such narratives served a dual purpose, legitimizing contemporary rulers through association with a sacred past, and providing structured accounts that communicated moral and political principles to the population. This process of mythologization demonstrates how memory and ideology intertwined in early Mesopotamian society. The Sumerian king list, compiled in multiple copies over centuries, provides further evidence for the blending of history and myth. The list names rulers in sequential order, often attributing extraordinary lifespans to early kings, a detail that signals both reverence and symbolic meaning. Archaeological finds, including administrative tablets and inscriptions, corroborate the existence of dynastic sequences while revealing the practical governance structures these rulers oversaw. Interpretive analysis suggests that the king list functioned as both a political document and a cultural narrative, preserving memory while reinforcing the divine legitimacy of urban elites. By encoding leadership within a mythic framework, Sumerian scribes created a model in which political authority and religious ideology were inseparable. Royal narratives from this period also emphasized the role of kings in maintaining societal stability. Texts describe military campaigns against rival city-states, the enforcement of legal codes, and the organization of labor for monumental construction. Archaeologists uncovered evidence of fortified walls, administrative buildings, and temple complexes from this era, all indicating the centralization of political and religious power. Analytical insight reveals that the construction of monumental architecture was not only practical but symbolic, signaling the king's capacity to mobilize resources and enforce social cohesion. These patterns of leadership provided the cultural and administrative template that later narratives, including the Gilgamesh epic, would build upon. The integration of divine sanction into kingship is particularly notable in the way rulers are portrayed in early Sumerian literature. Kings were often described as chosen by gods or endowed with superhuman attributes, reinforcing the perception that political authority was derived from cosmic order. In the case of Lugalbanda, texts describe him performing heroic feats sanctioned by the divine, establishing a precedent for framing historical figures as agents of both human and divine will. Interpretive analysis indicates that these narratives reflect systemic mechanisms of legitimization. By connecting rulers to supernatural authority, early Sumerian society codified a hierarchical structure in which obedience to leadership was both a civic duty and a religious obligation. The codification of these myths served not only to validate contemporary rulers but also to transmit collective memory across generations. The stories of Etna, Lugalbanda, and other semi-divine figures were copied, adapted, and circulated within scribal schools, ensuring that both historical and moral lessons were preserved. Archaeological evidence from school tablets demonstrates the inclusion of royal narratives alongside practical exercises in writing and arithmetic, suggesting that the education of scribes was closely tied to the preservation of cultural memory. This system of transmission underscores the broader principle that literacy and administrative record-keeping were integral to maintaining social order and ideological continuity in early Mesopotamian cities. By the end of the early dynastic period, these mythic frameworks had become deeply embedded in Sumerian political and cultural consciousness. The combination of monumental construction, administrative documentation, and literary codification established a durable model for the intertwining of history and myth. Interpretive insights suggest that the veneration of semi-divine kings reflects an early form of narrative institutionalization, wherein the memory of leadership was preserved not merely through chronicles but through stories that communicated both power and principle. Such narratives would directly influence the formation of heroic literature, including the earliest iterations of the Gilgamesh epic. Among these semi-divine figures, one name would echo through millennia: Gilgamesh. Positioned within the continuity of Uruk's dynastic memory, Gilgamesh embodies the synthesis of historical reality and mythic elaboration that characterizes early Mesopotamian kingship. Textual and archaeological evidence, including references in the Sumerian king list and later literary compositions, suggests that his reign was remembered as a time of monumental construction, military leadership, and cultural development. The narratives surrounding Gilgamesh demonstrate the capacity of early societies to transform political memory into enduring myth, providing both ideological legitimacy for rulers and a foundation for literary creativity that would shape the epic traditions of Mesopotamia. Whether myth or monarch, Gilgamesh's Uruk was a city of power and poetry. Archaeological excavations of Uruk's early dynastic layers reveal a city characterized by both monumental construction and organized administrative systems. The Iana precinct, in particular, contains substantial temple platforms and fortified precincts, demonstrating the centrality of religious institutions to political authority. Administrative tablets recovered from these strata indicate a complex bureaucracy managing temple holdings, labor obligations, and surplus distribution. This combination of monumental architecture and structured administration suggests a highly stratified society in which authority was concentrated among elites, with the king operating as both political and religious leader. The Sumerian king list identifies Gilgamesh as the fifth ruler of Uruk, attributing to him a reign of 126 years, a figure likely symbolic but reflective of his perceived importance. While no direct contemporary inscriptions confirm his existence, material evidence from early dynastic 3A/B levels at Uruk demonstrates a period of intensive building activity consistent with the centralization of authority attributed to his rule. Archaeologists uncovered large-scale construction projects, including defensive walls and public buildings, which imply coordinated labor forces under centralized management. Analytical observation indicates that Gilgamesh's historical persona, whether literal or composite, aligns with the structural characteristics of a ruler capable of mobilizing resources on a citywide scale. The socio-political environment of early dynastic Sumer was defined by a network of competing city-states, including Ur, Lagash, and Kish. Evidence from administrative tablets and economic records shows regular interaction between cities through trade, diplomacy, and occasional conflict. Uruk's position on the Euphrates facilitated both the export of surplus grain and access to imported goods such as timber, copper, and stone. Standardized weights and measures recovered from excavations indicate formalized trade regulations and a sophisticated system of economic administration. These findings suggest that Uruk's prosperity, and by extension Gilgamesh's political authority, depended on both local agricultural productivity and integration into regional exchange networks. Royal inscriptions and later literary references portray the king as an agent of monumental construction and civic organization. The Eanna temple complex, dedicated to Inanna, underwent significant expansion during this period, involving large-scale brick platforms, storage facilities, and administrative quarters. Interpretive analysis indicates that such projects served dual purposes: practical accommodation of population and resources, and ideological demonstration of the king's ability to maintain cosmic and social order. The integration of labor, material resources, and religious legitimacy exemplifies how early dynastic rulers transformed city planning into both administrative and symbolic instruments of authority. Military organization was also a component of Uruk's early dynastic polity. Archaeological evidence, including fortified walls and weaponry caches, demonstrates that city defense and the projection of military power were institutionalized functions. Textual sources, though limited, reference campaigns led by Uruk rulers against neighboring city-states, reinforcing the role of the king as both protector and hegemon. Analytical insight suggests that the combination of administrative control, religious sanction, and military capability created a resilient urban polity capable of sustaining large-scale social complexity in the early 3rd millennium BCE. Cultural developments during this period further contextualized the historical Gilgamesh. The emergence of proto-cuneiform writing allowed scribes to record economic, administrative, and ceremonial activities with increasing precision. Tokens, clay envelopes, and pictographic inscriptions provide evidence for systematic record-keeping and the institutionalization of literacy within the temple bureaucracy. The concentration of scribes within religious and administrative centers demonstrates the interdependence of literacy, governance, and ritual, establishing conditions under which historical memory could be preserved and transmitted. Analytical observation emphasizes that these practices created a framework for both factual record and literary codification, enabling the later immortalization of rulers like Gilgamesh in epic narrative. The material culture of early dynastic Uruk reflects both societal stratification and specialized production. Large-scale workshops for pottery, weaving, and metalwork indicate occupational differentiation and central control of resources. Residential architecture exhibits variation in size and construction quality, with larger dwellings likely associated with administrative or religious elites. This spatial differentiation reinforces the interpretation of a hierarchical urban society in which the king and priestly class exercised authority over both economic production and social organization. Analytical insights suggest that such social structures provided the necessary stability for the centralization of power and the flourishing of cultural activity, including storytelling and literary innovation. Evidence for ritual and ceremonial activity also underscores the integration of political and religious authority. Offerings, votive objects, and cultic installations within temple precincts indicate ongoing ceremonial practice coordinated by elites. These practices reinforce the king's role as mediator between the divine and the human, legitimizing decisions related to labor allocation, resource distribution, and civic planning. The intertwining of ritual, administration, and monumental construction illustrates how early dynastic rulers, including Gilgamesh, could assert authority through both practical governance and symbolic representation. By the mid-3rd millennium BCE, Uruk had established a model of urban governance, religious centralization, and socio-economic integration that would influence subsequent Sumerian city-states. Analytical insights indicate that the historical foundations of Gilgamesh's Uruk involved a combination of environmental adaptation, bureaucratic innovation, military organization, and ritual authority. These systemic developments provided the conditions necessary for the later literary preservation of Gilgamesh's deeds, bridging historical reality with mythic narrative. The city's physical and administrative infrastructure thus served as both the stage and the mechanism through which memory and legend could coalesce. Long after his reign, Sumerian poets began to immortalize his deeds. The material and textual foundations of early dynastic Uruk demonstrate that the convergence of political authority, urban complexity, and scribal literacy created the conditions for historical memory to evolve into narrative tradition. Gilgamesh's city exemplifies how early urban societies combined practical governance with symbolic representation, providing both the empirical and ideological context for one of humanity's earliest epic heroes. By the conclusion of this period, Uruk had transformed into a resilient, culturally rich, and administratively sophisticated center, a city capable of sustaining both historical authority and enduring myth. By the dawn of the second millennium BCE, Gilgamesh's memory was inked into clay. The earliest literary references to Gilgamesh appear in Sumerian poems composed during the UR3, circa 2112 to 2004 BCE, and Old Babylonian periods, circa 2000 to 1800 BCE. These texts, inscribed on clay tablets using cuneiform script, preserve narratives such as Gilgamesh and Aga, Gilgamesh and Huwawa, and the death of Gilgamesh. Archaeologists and philologists note that the surviving copies, though fragmentary, demonstrate both a continuity of narrative tradition and the evolution of literary style. The poems situate Gilgamesh within a historical and mythic framework, portraying him as a powerful, semi-divine king engaged in conflicts, quests, and ethical dilemmas that reflect the values and social concerns of early Mesopotamian society. Gilgamesh and Aga presents a narrative of political conflict, depicting Gilgamesh defending Uruk against external threats. The text emphasizes the king's role as both a military leader and protector of his city, reinforcing the integration of civic responsibility and royal authority. Administrative parallels are evident. The poem references duties similar to those recorded in UR3 economic tablets, including mobilization of labor and management of resources. Interpretive analysis suggests that these early narratives function to reinforce the legitimacy of kingship by framing the ruler's responsibilities within a story accessible to scribes, priests, and perhaps urban audiences. The integration of historical plausibility with literary elaboration demonstrates the systemic interplay of record-keeping, education, and cultural memory in Sumerian urban centers. Gilgamesh and Huwawa shifts the focus from political authority to heroic action. In this poem, Gilgamesh and his companion Enkidu undertake a perilous expedition to the cedar forest, confronting the guardian Huwawa. Archaeological evidence from temple libraries, including the scribal collections at Nippur and Ur, indicates that these texts circulated widely among literate elites, suggesting both their educational and ritual significance. Linguistic analysis reveals formulaic structures, repeated epithets, and mnemonic devices characteristic of oral and written composition during the period. Scholars interpret the poem as reflecting societal values, including courage, loyalty, and the negotiation of human and divine authority. The narrative demonstrates early Sumerian engagement with heroic archetypes, establishing thematic motifs later central to the Akkadian Epic of Gilgamesh. The death of Gilgamesh presents one of the earliest reflections on mortality and legacy. While less complete than other poems, it conveys Gilgamesh's confrontation with human finitude, illustrating how even semi-divine kings were subject to the limitations of life. Archaeological finds from UR3 scribal schools suggest that such texts were studied alongside administrative and literary exercises, underscoring the dual role of literature as both moral instruction and professional training. Interpretive insight indicates that these poems contributed to the institutional memory of kingship while exploring existential questions relevant to early urban populations, including the consequences of power, hubris, and human vulnerability. The language and transmission of these poems provide insight into the broader mechanisms of Sumerian literacy. Textual evidence shows that scribes used both syllabic and logographic signs, reflecting an evolving writing system adapted for literary expression. Tablets were often copied, recopied, and stored in temple archives, ensuring the preservation and dissemination of narrative tradition. Archaeological context, including the arrangement of tablets within administrative and cultic complexes, indicates that literary composition was intertwined with religious and bureaucratic functions. Analytical observation suggests that the convergence of literacy, administration, and ritual created a structured environment in which myth and history could be recorded, studied, and transmitted across generations. Themes within the Sumerian poems also reveal social and political structures of the period. The portrayal of Gilgamesh as a ruler engaged in both civic defense and supernatural quests reflects a dual emphasis on practical governance and moral exemplarity. Collaboration with figures such as Enkidu highlights early Sumerian concepts of social cohesion, loyalty, and the negotiation of authority. Encounters with divine figures, monsters, and natural hazards underscore the perceived relationship between human action and cosmic order. Interpretive analysis demonstrates that these narratives functioned as both cultural reinforcement of social norms and experimental exploration of ethical, political, and existential dilemmas. The fragmentary nature of surviving tablets complicates precise reconstruction of the poems but also reflects the dynamic nature of scribal transmission. Differences among copies reveal regional variations, editorial modifications, and pedagogical practices. Archaeologists recovered tablets from multiple sites, including Nippur, Ur, and Sippar, suggesting widespread circulation among elite scribal communities. This distribution indicates that Gilgamesh's stories were not localized tales, but part of a broader literary and educational network, preserved in written form for both instruction and ritual commemoration. Analytical observation highlights how these practices contributed to the resilience and adaptability of narrative memory, ensuring continuity across centuries. By the end of the Old Babylonian period, the Sumerian poems had established a foundational literary corpus that would inform subsequent Akkadian compositions. The combination of historical reference, heroic narrative, and moral reflection exemplifies early Mesopotamian approaches to literature, blending civic memory, religious ideology, and cultural pedagogy. Interpretive insights suggest that the structured transmission of these texts in temple and school contexts enabled the codification of mythic motifs, character archetypes, and narrative strategies that persisted into later epic traditions. The Sumerian poems thus represent both the culmination of early literary experimentation and the prelude to the broader Akkadian Epic of Gilgamesh. As Sumer declined, Akkadian scribes would preserve and transform the tale. The transition from Sumerian to Akkadian language, coupled with political and cultural shifts, would allow Gilgamesh's stories to reach a wider audience while incorporating new theological and literary frameworks. The underlying narrative structures, themes, and characterizations established in the Sumerian poems persisted, demonstrating the durability of early narrative innovation and the capacity of written culture to bridge linguistic, temporal, and political divides. These early texts, therefore, provide the essential foundation upon which the classical Epic of Gilgamesh was constructed. When the Sumerians vanished, their words lived on in a new tongue. By the early 2nd millennium BCE, political and cultural dominance in Mesopotamia had shifted from Sumerian-speaking city-states to Akkadian-speaking polities, including Babylon and Assur. Despite the decline of spoken Sumerian, the language persisted in administrative, scholarly, and religious contexts, maintained by bilingual scribes trained in temple schools. Archaeological evidence from sites such as Nippur and Sippar shows Sumerian lexical lists, bilingual dictionaries, and annotated tablets, indicating a structured effort to preserve Sumerian literary and ritual knowledge even as Akkadian became the vernacular language. During this period, the Gilgamesh narratives underwent adaptation into Akkadian, forming the earliest known iterations of what scholars now call the epic cycle. Tablets recovered from Old Babylonian archives, including the famous Library of Sippar and the collections at Nippur, contain fragments of episodes such as Gilgamesh's encounters with Humbaba and the Bull of Heaven, as well as his quest for immortality. Linguistic analysis demonstrates that scribes carefully translated, interpreted, and occasionally restructured the Sumerian source material, preserving narrative continuity while adjusting idiomatic expressions and stylistic conventions for Akkadian readers. Interpretive insight indicates that this bilingual mediation was central to the durability of the epic, enabling the stories to survive shifting linguistic and political landscapes. The adaptation process also reflects broader cultural integration. Akkadian scribes incorporated local deities, narrative conventions, and literary motifs, resulting in a text that simultaneously honored Sumerian origins and aligned with the cosmology and ideology of emerging Akkadian polities. Archaeological evidence, including seal impressions and administrative correspondence, demonstrates that the epic was copied and studied in temple and palace schools, suggesting its role in education, ritual performance, and elite cultural literacy. Analytical observation highlights that the transition from Sumerian to Akkadian was not a simple linguistic translation but a complex cultural negotiation, in which memory, ideology, and literary form were all actively preserved. The fragments of the Old Babylonian Gilgamesh tablets reveal both continuity and innovation. While the core heroic exploits of the Sumerian poems remain recognizable, Akkadian adaptations introduce thematic elaboration, extended dialogues, and expanded exploration of mortality and human limitation. These narrative expansions suggest that scribes sought to address evolving social, political, and theological concerns, integrating the heroic past into contemporary frameworks of kingship, divinity, and urban culture. Archaeological context indicates that these texts were circulated among literate elites, ensuring that Gilgamesh's memory remained both historically rooted and culturally resonant. In sum, the linguistic and cultural shift from Sumerian to Akkadian demonstrates the resilience of Mesopotamian literary tradition. Through the work of bilingual scribes, the Gilgamesh narratives were not only preserved but transformed, establishing the foundations of the classical Epic of Gilgamesh. Long after the decline of Sumerian city-states, these tales continued to inform political ideology, ethical reflection, and literary innovation. The continuity achieved through this bilingual mediation illustrates how ancient societies maintained cultural memory across linguistic and generational divides, setting the stage for the epic's most enduring iteration. In Babylon, the story would find its most enduring form. In an age of empires, Gilgamesh was reborn, now in Akkadian verse. By the time of Hammurabi's consolidation of Babylonian power in the early 18th century BCE, the Gilgamesh narratives had been fully integrated into the Akkadian literary tradition. This period, characterized by the centralization of political authority, urban expansion, and cultural standardization, provided fertile ground for literary production. The Old Babylonian epic, preserved in fragmentary tablets such as the Pennsylvania tablet and the Yale tablet, demonstrates a sophisticated synthesis of earlier Sumerian stories with Akkadian language, theology, and stylistic innovation. Archaeological evidence from Babylon and Nippur confirms the widespread circulation of these texts among temple libraries and scribal schools, highlighting their significance within the educational and religious framework of the period. The Old Babylonian epic consists of multiple episodes, including the slaying of Humbaba, the confrontation with the Bull of Heaven, and the quest for eternal life. Textual analysis indicates that the narrative maintains continuity with the earlier Sumerian poems while introducing significant expansions in dialogue, characterization, and thematic exploration. For example, the Pennsylvania tablet preserves a detailed account of Gilgamesh and Enkidu's expedition to the cedar forest, emphasizing both the logistical preparation and moral considerations of the heroic journey. Interpretive insights suggest that these literary expansions reflect the concerns of urban Babylonian society, including the negotiation of human ambition, divine authority, and ethical responsibility. The socio-political environment of Hammurabi's Babylon further contextualizes the Old Babylonian epic. During this period, the codification of law, monumental construction, and administrative standardization created a cultural climate in which literary works could serve multiple functions: historical record, moral instruction, and religious affirmation. Archaeological discoveries, including clay tablets with administrative, economic, and literary content, reveal that scribes were trained to reproduce and interpret texts within a standardized curriculum. Analytical observation suggests that the Old Babylonian epic functioned as both a product of elite literary culture and a tool for reinforcing social norms, linking heroic exemplars with contemporary governance and ethical practice. The adaptation of Gilgamesh into Old Babylonian Akkadian also reflects evolving theological frameworks. Deities such as Ishtar, Shamash, and Enlil play central roles in the narrative, interacting with human protagonists in ways that underscore divine oversight and cosmic order. Linguistic analysis shows careful integration of Akkadian religious terminology alongside narrative description, enabling the epic to serve as a medium for exploring questions of morality, justice, and mortality within a cosmological context. Interpretive insight highlights that the interplay between human and divine action in the text mirrors contemporary Babylonian concepts of kingship and societal regulation, reinforcing the relevance of the epic to its original audience. The physical transmission of the Old Babylonian epic illustrates both the durability and adaptability of the text. The Pennsylvania and Yale tablets, excavated in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, contain partial episodes that scholars have used to reconstruct the larger narrative. Comparison of these fragments with other Old Babylonian tablets from sites such as Sippar and Nippur reveals minor textual variations, indicating active scribal engagement and the potential for regional or pedagogical adaptation. Analytical observation suggests that such textual fluidity allowed the epic to maintain cultural resonance across temporal, geographic, and institutional contexts, demonstrating the role of scribal practices in the preservation and evolution of literary tradition. Characterization in the Old Babylonian epic reflects a nuanced approach to heroism and human limitation. Gilgamesh is portrayed as both powerful and fallible, capable of great accomplishments yet subject to grief, fear, and moral contemplation. The introduction of Enkidu as a complementary figure highlights the importance of social relationships, collaboration, and ethical guidance. These literary choices indicate a deliberate effort by scribes to engage with universal human concerns while situating the narrative within the socio-political and religious environment of Babylon. Interpretive insights suggest that the narrative's attention to human psychology, relational dynamics, and mortality marks a significant development in Mesopotamian literary sophistication. By situating the composition of the Old Babylonian epic within the Hammurabi era, it is evident that literary production was closely tied to political, religious, and educational infrastructure. The centralized authority of Babylon facilitated the standardization of scribal training, the preservation of texts, and the dissemination of cultural memory. Archaeological and textual evidence demonstrates that these developments enabled Gilgamesh to evolve from a collection of Sumerian episodes into a coherent, thematically rich epic capable of addressing the social, ethical, and theological concerns of early second millennium Mesopotamia. Analytical observation underscores that the epic's development was not merely literary but also systemic, reflecting the interplay of political power, education, and religious ideology. But the poem would not remain static. It evolved alongside Mesopotamian theology. Subsequent centuries would see additional revisions, expansions, and standardizations, culminating in the fully formed Babylonian versions preserved in the later 1st millennium BCE libraries. The Old Babylonian epic thus represents a critical stage in the evolution of Gilgamesh, a moment when historical memory, literary tradition, and theological reflection intersected within the cultural flowering of Hammurabi's Babylon. Its fragments bear witness to a dynamic process of textual transmission, scholarly preservation, and narrative refinement that would shape the epic's enduring legacy. The Old Babylonian poets transformed a king into a mirror for all humankind. Across the surviving fragments of the epic, narrative and theological motifs converge to explore friendship, mortality, divine authority, and the limitations inherent in human achievement. Gilgamesh's interactions with Enkidu exemplify the ethical and social dimensions of kingship, demonstrating how rulers were expected to balance personal ambition with civic responsibility. Archaeological evidence from temple archives, including scribal schools in Nippur and Babylon, indicates that these narratives were used as instructive texts for elite audiences, reinforcing both moral principles and the conceptualization of royal authority. The theme of mortality is central to the Old Babylonian epic. Following Enkidu's death, Gilgamesh confronts the inescapable finitude of human life, a motif that reflects broader Mesopotamian concerns with human vulnerability in the face of cosmic order. Tablets preserve episodes in which Gilgamesh seeks immortality through encounters with Utnapishtim, the survivor of a great flood, and the plant of rejuvenation. Interpretive analysis suggests that these narrative elements encode a complex understanding of temporality, emphasizing that human endeavor, no matter how monumental, remains constrained by divine and natural law. Archaeological and textual context underscores that the integration of the flood narrative connects Gilgamesh's personal quest to a larger mythological framework, demonstrating continuity with Sumerian traditions and shared Near Eastern cosmology. Kingship, as portrayed in the Old Babylonian epic, intertwines practical authority with ethical responsibility. Gilgamesh's actions, both heroic and reckless, serve as exemplars for the governance of cities, reflecting contemporary Mesopotamian ideals of justice, protection, and social stewardship. Administrative parallels are evident. Scribal texts from Uruk and Babylon detail similar concerns regarding labor organization, resource management, and civic oversight. Analytical observation indicates that the literary treatment of kingship provided a mechanism for articulating the moral and civic obligations of rulers, presenting a model in which personal prowess must be balanced with accountability to both human subjects and the divine order. Friendship between Gilgamesh and Enkidu constitutes a structural and ethical axis within the narrative. Enkidu's introduction, his integration into Uruk, and his eventual death highlight the interplay between companionship, mutual instruction, and the shaping of human identity. Literary analysis demonstrates that their relationship provides both emotional and didactic functions, emphasizing the value of social bonds in mediating human experience and responsibility. Archaeologists and philologists note that the depiction of friendship and loss within these tablets reflects early Mesopotamian recognition of communal interdependence and the social dimension of ethical behavior, linking narrative to civic and moral instruction. Divine order permeates the Old Babylonian epic, structuring human activity within the constraints of cosmic authority. Deities such as Shamash, Ishtar, and Enlil act as arbiters of fate, reinforcing the limits of human agency while rewarding or punishing according to adherence to ethical and ritual norms. Linguistic analysis of Akkadian terms for justice, destiny, and divine mandate indicates that scribes were attentive to precise theological vocabulary, ensuring that the narrative reflected contemporary cosmological understanding. Interpretive insight suggests that this interplay between divine and human action was integral to the educational and religious functions of the epic, allowing it to serve as both moral exemplum and cosmological reflection. The exploration of human limitation is further reinforced through motifs of trial and quest. Gilgamesh's encounters with monstrous forces, perilous landscapes, and the inevitability of death convey lessons regarding the balance between ambition and humility. Tablets such as the Pennsylvania fragments preserve formulaic expressions and repetitive narrative structures that emphasize these ethical and existential concerns. Archaeological studies confirm that such textual patterns were widely taught in scribal schools, indicating that the thematic focus on mortality and limitation was both a literary device and a pedagogical tool, reinforcing cultural values and societal norms. The flood narrative within the Old Babylonian epic serves as a crucial bridge between human experience and divine order. By presenting Utnapishtim as both survivor and recipient of divine favor, the text illustrates the continuity of cosmic principles across generations. Analytical observations suggest that this inclusion situates Gilgamesh's personal quest within a universal framework, linking individual mortality to collective historical memory and theological understanding. Archaeological evidence for flood-related ritual and myth in Mesopotamian sites further supports the centrality of this motif, demonstrating its cultural resonance and didactic function. Centuries later, Assyrian scribes would refine this vision into its final canonical form. The thematic framework established in the Old Babylonian epic, the interplay of friendship, mortality, kingship, and divine authority, provided a template for the standardization of the epic in the first millennium BCE. The careful codification and transmission of these motifs reflect a deliberate scholarly effort to preserve ethical, civic, and cosmological lessons, ensuring that Gilgamesh remained both a historical and literary exemplar. This evolution underscores the systemic integration of literature, pedagogy, and religious ideology in Mesopotamian civilization, illustrating how narrative functioned as both record and moral guide. In schoolrooms of clay, the epic endured one stylus stroke at a time. The preservation of the Epic of Gilgamesh depended on the skill and discipline of scribes, the professional custodians of Mesopotamian culture. Archaeological discoveries from sites such as Nippur, Sippar, and Babylon reveal the organization of scribal schools, or Aduba, where students learned the complex system of cuneiform writing. These institutions trained scribes not only in technical literacy but also in the intellectual and theological foundations of their civilization. Exercises on practice tablets, containing excerpts from royal hymns and early versions of the epic, demonstrate how Gilgamesh's story served as both a linguistic model and a moral text. The process of scribal education was rigorous. Students began by copying lexical lists, standardized word inventories, before progressing to proverbs, myths, and extended narratives. The act of inscribing wet clay with a stylus required precision, as each wedge-shaped mark carried semantic and phonetic significance. Advanced pupils were eventually entrusted with the reproduction of canonical literature, including the Epic of Gilgamesh. Archaeological contexts show that these copies often contained minor variations, reflecting both the evolving Akkadian language and regional literary traditions. Such deviations, though small, provide crucial evidence of the text's organic transmission and the interpretive role of individual scribes. Cuneiform writing itself contributed to the durability of the epic. Once dried or baked, clay tablets could survive for millennia. Many of the surviving fragments of the Epic of Gilgamesh come from scribal archives buried or destroyed during urban collapse. The resilience of clay as a medium ensured that even when cities fell, their words endured. Epigraphic studies reveal careful collation marks, colophons, and scribal signatures, evidence of a structured effort to preserve the integrity of literary works. These markings confirm that Mesopotamian scribes regarded their craft as both intellectual and sacred labor, connecting their work to divine patronage, particularly under the god of writing, Nabu. The scribe's role extended beyond mere reproduction. They were editors, translators, and interpreters who maintained and refined the epic through successive generations. Comparative analysis with other Akkadian literature, such as Atrahasis, Enuma Elish, and royal inscriptions, reveals shared themes and vocabulary, suggesting that scribes operated within a unified literary and theological tradition. The Epic of Gilgamesh, in this context, functioned as both a masterpiece of poetic art and a training text that shaped the literary sensibilities of Mesopotamian intellectuals. From Babylon to Nineveh, the tale crossed centuries. Through the diligence of these scribes, the story of Gilgamesh survived linguistic change, political upheaval, and cultural transformation. Their work ensured that the epic remained not only a relic of antiquity but a living monument of human thought, a text that bridged myth and history and carried the voice of ancient Sumer into the empires that followed. By the late second millennium, the epic achieved its definitive form. Out of centuries of oral transmission, fragmented poems, and bilingual traditions emerged a single, cohesive version. The essay Nagba Emuru, He Who Saw the Deep. This standard Babylonian recension represented both a culmination of literary refinement and a transformation in theological vision. At its center stood a name preserved in colophons and later scholarly lists, Sinlekianini. Traditionally regarded as the editor or compiler of the canonical text, Sinlekianini operated within the milieu of learned scribes who sought to codify the intellectual and religious heritage of Mesopotamia. Whether he was a single historical individual or a symbolic figure representing a scribal lineage remains uncertain, yet his name became synonymous with the authoritative version of Gilgamesh's story. The standard Babylonian epic did not merely rearrange older Sumerian or Old Babylonian narratives. It reinterpreted them. The structure of 12 tablets introduced a deliberate narrative unity, with new prologues and epilogues framing Gilgamesh's journey as an inquiry into existence itself. The phrase essay Nagba Emuru, He Who Saw the Deep, encapsulated a new philosophical dimension, the hero's confrontation not only with death, but with the limits of human understanding. In this form, Gilgamesh was not simply a ruler or demigod but an archetype of knowledge-seeking, a figure whose exploration of the world mirrored the intellectual curiosity of the scribal class that preserved him. Philological analysis reveals significant differences between the standard Babylonian and earlier Old Babylonian tablets. The flood narrative, for instance, was expanded and integrated with material from the Atrahasis myth, aligning the epic with broader Mesopotamian cosmology. The depiction of Utnapishtim, the survivor of the flood, was deepened to explore divine justice and human mortality. Likewise, the relationship between Gilgamesh and Enkidu acquired greater moral and spiritual weight. The revised narrative emphasized transformation through suffering, a reflection of late second millennium theological thought, which increasingly stressed humility before the divine order. Archaeological finds from Nineveh, Assur, and Babylon indicate that copies of the standard Babylonian text circulated widely, suggesting its canonical status by the early 1st millennium BCE. The script employed was a refined Neo-Babylonian cuneiform, and the language was a learned dialect of Akkadian, already somewhat archaic to contemporary speakers. This deliberate archaism lent the text an aura of authority, situating it alongside the revered literature of earlier ages. The epic's vocabulary and meter also demonstrate a conscious artistic polish. Balance clauses, formulaic repetition, and carefully modulated rhythm. These features point to the work of a literary editor who viewed the epic as both sacred text and poetic art. Interpretively, Sinlekianini's version served to harmonize divergent strands of Mesopotamian religion, heroism, mortality, divine justice, and the boundaries of human achievement. It offered an intellectual synthesis, an epic that functioned as theology, wisdom literature, and royal mirror. In emphasizing the futility of defying mortality, it aligned with the broader religious sensibility of first millennium Babylon, in which knowledge and acceptance replaced conquest as signs of wisdom. The hero's ultimate return to Uruk, where he contemplates the city's enduring walls, represented not defeat but comprehension. The understanding that human creation, not immortality, endures as civilization's testament. Records indicate that the standard Babylonian recension became the reference version for scribal study. Its influence extended beyond literary circles, shaping Mesopotamian thought about kingship and human limitation. Later catalogs and scholia identify the work under Sinlekianini's name, affirming its position within the corpus of canonical texts. The editorial process he represented, one of systematization and theological integration, reflected a broader intellectual movement in Mesopotamia, the desire to organize mythic heritage into a coherent moral order. By the close of the 2nd millennium BCE, the Epic of Gilgamesh stood not as a regional legend, but as the literary crown of Mesopotamia's cultural memory. Its synthesis of poetic artistry and spiritual inquiry marked it as one of the earliest known philosophical works in human history. Its words would travel north to the libraries of kings. In the palace library of Nineveh, the oldest epic slept beneath imperial ambition. During the reign of Ashurbanipal, r. 669 to 631 BCE, the Assyrian Empire reached both its greatest territorial extent and its highest level of bureaucratic and intellectual organization. Among the king's most enduring achievements was the creation of a vast royal library within his palace complex at Nineveh. Excavated in the 19th century, this archive yielded over 30,000 clay tablets and fragments, the most comprehensive cuneiform collection ever discovered. Within this monumental corpus lay multiple copies of the Epic of Gilgamesh, preserved in the standard Babylonian recension. Ashurbanipal's library was both a political and scholarly enterprise. The king, who prided himself on being literate in Sumerian and Akkadian, viewed written knowledge as a form of imperial authority. Contemporary inscriptions proclaim, "I have read the cunning of the gods and the secret writings of all the scribes." This claim reflected the Assyrian ideology of centralized wisdom, the monarch as both warrior and intellectual custodian. To consolidate this cultural power, Ashurbanipal ordered the systematic collection of texts from across Mesopotamia, from Babylon, Nippur, Sippar, and Uruk. Administrative letters from the period record royal directives sent to temple libraries, commanding the dispatch of rare or exemplary works to Nineveh for copying. The project created an archive that functioned not only as a repository but as a center of textual production. The Epic of Gilgamesh held a prominent position within this library. Excavations directed by Austen Henry Layard and Hormizd Rassam in the mid-19th century uncovered fragments from at least 12 tablets corresponding to the canonical version. These tablets, written in the Neo-Assyrian dialect of Akkadian, contain colophons identifying their scribal origins. The colophons frequently include the phrase, Palace of Ashurbanipal, King of the World, King of Assyria, underscoring the royal sponsorship of their preservation. Comparative study of the Nineveh tablets has revealed multiple scribal hands, indicating that the epic was copied by a team of trained specialists. Minor textual variants among the fragments attest to active editorial engagement rather than mere mechanical reproduction. Scribal methods within the palace followed the traditional Adubba model inherited from Babylonian precedent. Apprentices and master scribes worked side by side, referencing exemplar tablets to ensure textual fidelity. The clay used for the Nineveh tablets was carefully prepared, often burnished and baked for durability. Each tablet's obverse and reverse were inscribed with precise alignment, demonstrating the high aesthetic and technical standards of Assyrian scribal culture. The presence of correction marks and guidelines reveals an environment of disciplined textual control, where accuracy was both a professional obligation and an act of piety. The theological and literary value of the Epic of Gilgamesh within the Assyrian context is evident in the care devoted to its preservation. The Assyrian scribes regarded the work not simply as ancient literature but as a text embodying divine and moral instruction. Its themes, the limits of human power, the inevitability of death, and the pursuit of wisdom, resonated with imperial ideology. Just as Gilgamesh sought eternal renown, the Assyrian kings sought to immortalize their conquests through monumental inscriptions and libraries of knowledge. The epic's inclusion thus symbolized continuity between mythic and royal aspirations, the preservation of fame against the erosion of time. Philological analysis shows that the Nineveh tablets closely correspond to the version attributed to Sinleki-Anini, though minor orthographic and lexical differences suggest regional adaptation. Some fragments also contain glosses and explanatory notations, possibly added by court scholars to aid in interpretation. This indicates that the library functioned as a working archive rather than a ceremonial collection. The integration of both literary and lexical materials within the same shelves allowed Assyrian intellectuals to study the epic alongside other foundational texts, including omen series, incantations, and wisdom literature. The survival of the Nineveh tablets owes as much to destruction as to preservation. When the city was sacked by a coalition of Medes and Babylonians in 612 BCE, the palace was burned and buried under rubble. Ironically, the fire that consumed the city also baked the clay tablets, hardening them into the durable artifacts recovered millennia later. In their charred remains lay the entire intellectual memory of Mesopotamia, the voices of scribes, poets, and kings who had shaped the region's thought for 2,000 years. The discovery of these fragments in the 19th century revolutionized the study of the ancient Near East. When George Smith of the British Museum first recognized the flood tablet among the debris, it provided the earliest known parallel to the biblical deluge narrative. His 1872 public reading electrified Victorian audiences, reuniting modern scholarship with a story that had been lost for over 2 millennia. The fragments from Nineveh, painstakingly reassembled, revealed not only the literary sophistication of Mesopotamian civilization but the continuity of human inquiry into mortality, meaning, and divine order. Yet when Assyria fell, the epic was lost to time, until modern spades unearthed it again. At its heart, the epic confronts the oldest question: how should mortals live knowing they must die? The standard Babylonian Epic of Gilgamesh, as preserved in 12 tablets, stands as the most complete and philosophically developed version of the Mesopotamian narrative tradition. Its structure reflects deliberate literary design rather than the simple aggregation of older myths. Each tablet contributes to a coherent thematic progression, from the assertion of royal power to the recognition of human limitation. In this arrangement, the poem functions as both narrative and meditation, tracing the transformation of its hero from a tyrant to a seeker of wisdom. Tablet I opens with a prologue that situates Gilgamesh as he who saw the deep, the foundation of the land, immediately establishing him as a figure who has transcended ordinary human experience. This introduction serves not merely as praise but as a summary of the poem's intellectual project, the pursuit of knowledge through suffering. The initial description of Uruk's monumental walls, which concludes the epic as well, frames the narrative within the permanence of human creation. The cyclical structure reinforces the theme that while human life is transient, cultural achievement endures. The early tablets, 1-3, introduce Gilgamesh's unrestrained power and the creation of Enkidu, a wild man fashioned by the gods to humble the king. Their encounter and ensuing friendship establish the central human relationship of the epic. Through Enkidu, Gilgamesh confronts his own reflection, strength untempered by understanding. The slaying of Humbaba, guardian of the cedar forest, in Tablet V, and the defeat of the Bull of Heaven in Tablet 6, mark the apex of their shared heroism. Yet these victories also constitute acts of hubris, challenging divine order and precipitating divine punishment. Enkidu's death in Tablet 7 marks the emotional and moral pivot of the narrative, transforming the heroic quest into a philosophical journey. Tablets 8-11 chronicle Gilgamesh's search for immortality, not as conquest, but as inquiry. His journey beyond the known world, through the mountains of Mashu and across the waters of death, recalls earlier Mesopotamian cosmologies that divided the universe into distinct realms of gods, humans, and the dead. The encounter with Utnapishtim, survivor of the flood, integrates the Atrahasis tradition and positions the epic within a broader theological framework concerning divine justice and cosmic balance. Utnapishtim's account of the flood reaffirms the permanence of mortality as a divine decree, while the test of sleeplessness and the subsequent loss of the plant of life dramatize human incapacity to transcend that law. The 12th tablet, often regarded as a later addition, returns to Enkidu in the underworld and revisits earlier Sumerian materials. Though its tone differs from the preceding narrative, it completes the philosophical arc by reinforcing the futility of seeking permanence in the realm of the dead. Scholars interpret its inclusion as a deliberate coda, situating the hero's enlightenment within the full cycle of life, death, and remembrance. The structure as a whole thus mirrors the intellectual journey of Mesopotamian civilization itself, from mythic confidence to reflective acceptance. Theologically, the epic presents a synthesis of Mesopotamian religious thought. It portrays the gods as powerful but morally ambiguous beings whose decrees sustain cosmic order but often appear arbitrary to human perception. Unlike later monotheistic systems, divine justice in the Epic of Gilgamesh is not absolute but balanced. The gods enforce mortality not as punishment, but as the condition that gives human life meaning. Gilgamesh's eventual realization, that immortality lies in enduring works rather than in the body, aligns with the broader Mesopotamian concept of Sumsu, or lasting name. Through this lens, Uruk's walls and the written record of his deeds represent the hero's true immortality. The poem's moral and psychological insight marks it as a foundational work of humanistic literature. It explores existential questions through narrative form rather than doctrinal statement. The progression from external conquest to internal understanding parallels the Mesopotamian transition from heroic kingship to administrative and intellectual governance during the late 2nd millennium BCE. Thus, the epic's enduring resonance lies in its fusion of personal and civilizational introspection. Linguistically, the text exemplifies the artistry of Akkadian poetry. Parallelism, repetition, and controlled variation produce rhythm and emphasis, while formulaic epithets create continuity across scenes. Modern philological studies indicate that such techniques were consciously employed to aid oral recitation and mnemonic retention, suggesting that the epic retained performative dimensions even in its written form. The standardized sequence of tablets also allowed scribes to use the work as an educational text, each episode teaching lessons in both language and morality. Interpretively, The Epic of Gilgamesh can be understood as a mirror of Mesopotamian self-awareness. It articulates a worldview in which mortality defines, rather than diminishes, human significance. The hero's final act, to display Uruk's enduring walls, affirms that civilization itself is humanity's answer to death. In this sense, the poem transcends its mythic origins to become a reflection on the very process of civilization, the transformation of ephemeral life into lasting form through memory, architecture, and writing. Yet for millennia, the poem remained buried and forgotten. For over 2,000 years, the tablets lay mute beneath desert sands. With the Persian conquest of Babylon in 539 BCE, Mesopotamia entered a new political and cultural era that gradually extinguished the cuneiform world. Cyrus the Great's administration preserved many local institutions, yet the scribal traditions that had flourished for 3 millennia began to wane. Aramaic replaced Akkadian as the language of bureaucracy, and the wedge-shaped script that had recorded the thoughts of kings, priests, and poets slowly receded from daily use. By the late Achaemenid and early Hellenistic periods, the scribes who could still read or inscribe cuneiform had become a narrow priestly minority, their craft sustained only within temple archives. The temples of Babylon and Uruk, once centers of literary and astronomical scholarship, persisted for a time under Persian and later Seleucid rule. Clay tablets from this era show that scribes continued to record astronomical observations, rituals, and incantations, but the copying of older literary texts all but ceased. The Epic of Gilgamesh, though once canonical, no longer served administrative or religious functions in this changing world. As papyrus and parchment spread westward from Egypt, clay lost its practicality as a medium of record. The physical act of pressing a stylus into wet clay, so central to Mesopotamian identity, faded from cultural memory. The conquest of Alexander the Great in 331 BCE and the establishment of Seleucid rule accelerated this process of transformation. Greek became the language of scholarship and governance, and Hellenistic centers such as Seleucia on the Tigris drew elites into a cosmopolitan intellectual sphere dominated by Mediterranean rather than Mesopotamian models. Although Greek historians such as Berossus, a Babylonian priest writing in Greek around 280 BCE, transmitted fragments of Mesopotamian myth to the wider world, his accounts were summaries, not continuations of the old tradition. Berossus' retelling of the flood and early kings preserved echoes of Gilgamesh, but the poem itself was no longer copied or read. By the 1st centuries CE, under Parthian and then Sasanian rule, the ability to read cuneiform was effectively extinct. Inscriptions continued in Aramaic-derived scripts such as Syriac and Middle Persian, while the cities of Mesopotamia were absorbed into broader imperial and religious currents. The rise of Christianity and later Islam transformed the intellectual landscape of the Near East. Babylonian temples were abandoned or converted, and with them vanished the last repositories of cuneiform literature. The old libraries, buried beneath layers of urban debris, passed into legend. Local inhabitants of Mesopotamia, encountering inscribed bricks or carved tablets, sometimes referred to them as nails of the ancients, visible yet unreadable relics of a forgotten people. The memory of Gilgamesh himself survived only indirectly. Classical authors such as Aelian and later medieval commentators transmitted distorted echoes of Near Eastern heroes, Nimrod, Enmerkar, and others, whose attributes may have derived from the ancient epic's protagonist. Yet these were shadows without texts. When Islamic geographers described the ruins of Babylon or Nineveh, they recorded awe but not comprehension. To the scholars of the Abbasid era, Mesopotamia's pre-Islamic past was known chiefly through biblical and Greek intermediaries. The cuneiform script, undeciphered and unrecognized, remained a mystery even to antiquarians who walked among its remnants. Archaeological neglect ensured further loss. For centuries, the ruins of Mesopotamian cities lay under the alluvial plains of Iraq and Syria, covered by wind-blown earth and seasonal floods. The once great cities of Uruk, Babylon, and Nineveh became shapeless mounds known to local populations as tells. Periodic travelers, from Herodotus in antiquity to early modern explorers, described these sites without realizing that entire archives still lay entombed beneath them. The environmental cycle of erosion and deposition preserved the clay tablets in remarkable condition, but it also concealed them from view. The rediscovery of the ancient Near East began only with the rise of European exploration and antiquarian interest in the 18th and early 19th centuries. Scholars seeking biblical corroboration turned their attention eastward, to the lands between the Tigris and Euphrates. Initial travelers, such as Carsten Niebuhr and Claudius James Rich, surveyed the visible remains at Persepolis, Babylon, and Nineveh, noting strange wedge-like inscriptions on stones and bricks. Though unable to read them, they correctly suspected that these markings represented an ancient system of writing. Their collections of impressions and sketches brought the first tangible evidence of cuneiform back to Europe, reawakening scholarly curiosity about Mesopotamia's lost civilizations. By that time, however, the Epic of Gilgamesh and the entire literary corpus of Mesopotamia had been silent for more than 2 millennia. The continuity of the world's earliest literature had been broken, its linguistic code forgotten, its tablets scattered and buried. The intellectual traditions of Greece, Rome, and later Europe evolved independently, unaware that older antecedents lay beneath the Mesopotamian soil. The voices of Gilgamesh, Enkidu, and the scribes of Uruk had disappeared from human knowledge, their words reduced to enigmatic symbols on crumbling clay. In this long silence, Mesopotamia itself became a legend. The biblical figure of Nimrod came to symbolize the archetypal ancient monarch, conflating fragments of historical memory with moral allegory. The ruins of Babel were imagined as monuments to human pride, not as repositories of scientific or literary genius. What had once been a vibrant continuum of textual culture now existed only as moral myth. Thus, from the Persian conquest to the dawn of modern archaeology, the story of Gilgamesh passed into complete oblivion. Cuneiform, humanity's first script, was unread, and the earliest literature ever composed lay dormant beneath the earth, awaiting rediscovery. In the age of exploration, that silence was broken. Where once kings ruled and poets wrote, the sands reclaimed their dominion. In the centuries following Babylon's fall, the heartland of Mesopotamia, cradle of cities, writing, and empire, slowly vanished beneath its own dust. The rivers shifted course, irrigation canals silted over, and the fields that once fed Sumer and Akkad turned to wilderness. Clay tablets, the very medium that had preserved Mesopotamian thought for millennia, became the reason for its silence. Fragile yet durable, they survived only when buried, forgotten, sealed away from human touch. By the first millennium CE, the wedge-shaped script of the ancient scribes was not merely obsolete, it was incomprehensible. Cuneiform inscriptions still adorned ruined walls and temple foundations, but to later inhabitants they were strange markings, nails of the ancients, traces of a people long dissolved into legend. Even in the heart of Mesopotamia, no one could read the words that once bound gods to kings or gave voice to the laments of Uruk. The thread of textual memory, stretched across 3,000 years, had finally snapped. Meanwhile, the civilizations that followed, the Persians, the Greeks, the Romans, the Arabs, layered new histories over the old. Babylon became a parable of arrogance in the Hebrew Bible and later the Quran, the city of pride, confusion, and divine judgment. Gilgamesh, once a hero of mortal striving, was absorbed into mythic archetypes such as Nimrod, a symbol of the tyrant builder brought low. The real landscapes of Mesopotamia turned to symbols in distant texts, and the physical cities beneath the soil became ghosts. Travelers from the classical world to the medieval Islamic era continued to visit the plains between the Tigris and Euphrates. Greek geographers described Babylon's vast perimeter walls, already crumbling. Later, Arab chroniclers such as Al-Yaqub and Ibn Hawqal marveled at the scale of ruins, but could not decipher their purpose. They saw the remains of ziggurats and palaces, towering mounds of mud brick, and speculated that they were the remnants of the Tower of Babel or the cities of the prophets. The physical evidence of one of humanity's first civilizations persisted, but its meaning was filtered through the lenses of scripture and legend. By the Renaissance and Enlightenment, Mesopotamia had become a distant echo in European imagination, an exotic backdrop to biblical history rather than a source of knowledge in its own right. Scholars debated the location of ancient Babylon, relying on Greek accounts by Herodotus and Strabo. Artists depicted the city as a symbol of human folly, crowned by its fabled tower. Yet even as empires rose and fell across the Middle East, the true heritage of Sumer, Akkad, and Assyria lay undisturbed beneath the alluvial plains, entombed by centuries of wind-blown soil. It was in this long interval that cultural memory proved its fragility. The first script, the first libraries, the earliest scientific records, all had been erased from collective awareness. Humanity forgot that it had once remembered so much. The achievements of Mesopotamian civilization, its mathematics, medicine, mythology, survived only through faint reflections in the cultures that succeeded it. The flood stories of the Hebrews and Greeks, the cosmologies of Persia and Anatolia, all bore hidden traces of the world buried beneath Iraq's deserts, though no one yet knew their source. When early modern travelers reached the Near East in the 17th and 18th centuries, they stood upon the remains of ancient cities without realizing it. Caravans passed the great mounds known as Babel, Kuyunjik, and Nimrud, their surfaces strewn with bricks impressed with mysterious wedge marks. Local villagers sometimes reused these bricks in their own buildings, unaware that they bore fragments of the world's oldest literature. To European visitors, the ruins were curiosities, vestiges of Oriental antiquity, not keys to a lost language. A few, however, began to suspect their deeper significance. Jesuit missionaries and antiquarians noted the precision of the inscriptions and proposed that they might represent writing rather than ornament. Yet, without a Rosetta Stone equivalent, the code of cuneiform remained locked. The buried cities, Nineveh, Babylon, Uruk, awaited the convergence of archaeology and philology that would come only with the 19th century's age of exploration. For now, silence reigned. Beneath layers of earth and myth, the libraries of kings slept in perfect darkness. Tablets bearing the dreams, fears, and wisdom of the world's first poets endured untouched by human hands. The script that had once given voice to the gods was forgotten. The cities that had built the earliest civilizations lay entombed, and the memory of humanity's first epic awaited its resurrection. Then, in the 19th century, shovels and scholars uncovered the first signs of awakening. From cuneiform fragments, modern scholars reconstructed the dawn of literature. The rediscovery of the Epic of Gilgamesh in the late 19th century marked one of the great intellectual recoveries of modern times. Once the tablets from Nineveh and other Mesopotamian sites reached European museums, philologists began the long process of decipherment. Early efforts by Henry Rawlinson, George Smith, and their successors revealed that these wedge-shaped marks recorded not mere inventories or contracts, but poetry, the oldest known to humanity. In 1872, Smith's reading of the Flood Tablet astonished the world. Here was a Mesopotamian deluge narrative centuries older than the Book of Genesis. The forgotten voice of Gilgamesh had spoken again, and with it, the origins of written storytelling emerged from the earth. Throughout the 20th century, Assyriology matured into a distinct academic discipline. Universities in London, Berlin, and Chicago founded cuneiform studies departments, and systematic publication of tablet corpora began. Texts were photographed, transliterated, and translated. Thousands of fragmentary pieces were catalogued. The Epic of Gilgamesh, preserved in multiple versions across different dialects of Akkadian, demanded careful collation and reconstruction. Scholars such as S. Kramer, Thorkild Jacobson, and Andrew George assembled composite editions, comparing Old Babylonian and Standard Babylonian recensions to approximate a coherent narrative. Each discovery refined understanding of the epic's structure, language, and theology, demonstrating that the poem was not a single author's creation, but the cumulative expression of centuries of Mesopotamian thought. This scholarly enterprise revealed the sophistication of ancient Near Eastern literature. The narrative's use of parallelism, repetition, and symbolic imagery indicated a fully developed poetic tradition. Linguistic analysis showed a mastery of Akkadian meter and idiom, comparable in artistry to later Greek epic. Interpretive studies traced the development of motifs, friendship, mortality, divine justice, from Sumerian prototypes into the mature philosophical discourse of the Babylonian version. Gilgamesh's dialogues with Enkidu, Siduri, and Utnapishtim came to be read not only as mythic episodes but as early reflections on human finitude and the limits of royal power. Comparative mythology placed the epic within a broader ancient context. The flood story found in Tablet 11 paralleled the biblical account of Noah, while earlier Sumerian traditions anticipated later Greek and Hebrew cosmologies. The hero's journey to the edges of the world resonated with Indo-European myths of the seeker of immortality. These correspondences did not imply direct borrowing but revealed a shared symbolic vocabulary across the ancient Near East. As historians observed, Mesopotamia's cultural influence radiated outward through trade, conquest, and religious exchange, shaping the mythic imagination of later civilizations. Modern literary theory further expanded interpretation. Structuralists identified the epic as a foundational myth of civilization, contrasting nature and culture through the transformation of Enkidu from wild man to citizen. Psychoanalytic readings emphasized the story's exploration of grief and self-awareness, framing Gilgamesh's quest as a confrontation with mortality and the unconscious. More recent scholarship, influenced by historical anthropology, situates the poem within its socio-political environment, an expression of early urban kingship grappling with the tension between divine mandate and human limitation. Each interpretive approach, though distinct, reinforces the epic's position as a document that transcends its time, both a record of early Mesopotamian ideology and a universal meditation on human existence. Archaeological discoveries continued to complement philological progress. Excavations at sites such as Sippar, Nippur, and Uar uncovered additional fragments, sometimes confirming earlier reconstructions, sometimes challenging them. Advances in imaging and digital epigraphy in the 21st century have allowed scholars to reunite dispersed fragments virtually, refining translations with unprecedented accuracy. Projects such as the Electronic Text Corpus of Sumerian Literature and the Cuneiform Digital Library Initiative have made primary sources globally accessible, transforming the study of ancient texts from a specialized pursuit into a collaborative international enterprise. By the early 21st century, the Epic of Gilgamesh had become a cornerstone of world literature curricula. Translations reached broad audiences, from poetic renderings by N.K. Sandars and Stephen Mitchell to philologically exact editions by Andrew George and Benjamin Foster. Its themes, the pursuit of wisdom, the acceptance of mortality, and the enduring search for meaning, secured its place alongside Homer, Dante, and Shakespeare. Scholars continue to debate its theological nuances and historical layers, but its status as humanity's earliest masterpiece is no longer contested. Through the combined work of archaeologists, linguists, and historians, modern scholarship has restored a voice lost for over 2 millennia. The Epic of Gilgamesh now stands not only as a relic of Mesopotamian civilization but as the first chapter in the history of literature itself. The Epic of Gilgamesh had returned to shape the modern imagination. Piece by piece, scholars resurrected a poem older than Homer. The rediscovery of the Epic of Gilgamesh was not an act of chance, but the cumulative result of philological precision, archaeological persistence, and scholarly collaboration spanning more than a century. Its recovery marked one of the greatest intellectual achievements of modern historiography, the decipherment of the lost languages of Mesopotamia and the restoration of the world's earliest literary voice. The process began in the early 19th century, when explorers and antiquarians, working under the auspices of European powers, unearthed tens of thousands of inscribed clay tablets from the ruins of ancient Mesopotamia. Excavations at Nineveh, Nimrud, and Babylon yielded vast archives of wedge-shaped marks impressed upon baked clay, a script no one alive could yet read. The British Museum's acquisitions under Austen Henry Layard in the 1840s and 1850s provided the crucial material foundation for modern Assyriology. But without a deciphered script, these artifacts remained silent witnesses to an unknown civilization. The breakthrough came through the study of cuneiform, a writing system that had evolved in Sumer by the late 4th millennium BCE. Scholars such as George Friedrich Grotefend and Henry Rawlinson dedicated decades to cracking its logic. Working with multilingual inscriptions, most notably the Behistun inscription of Darius I in Iran, they applied the comparative method used in deciphering Egyptian hieroglyphs. Rawlinson's transcription of the trilingual text, Old Persian, Elamite, and Akkadian, provided the key to understanding Akkadian grammar and vocabulary. By the 1850s, the essential phonetic and grammatical structures of cuneiform were known, and for the first time in millennia, the voices of Mesopotamia could be heard again. With the language unlocked, attention turned to the literary content of the tablets. The first translators were military officers, linguists, and biblical scholars rather than professional archaeologists. Their motives often lay in comparative religion. They sought evidence of the flood of Babel of early monotheism. George Smith, a self-taught scholar at the British Museum, made the epical discovery in 1872 of a tablet recounting a great deluge. Its parallels to the Noah story electrified both academia and the public, linking Mesopotamian myth directly to the foundations of Western scripture. Smith's Chaldean account of Genesis, 1876, popularized the notion that the Bible itself preserved echoes of a far older Mesopotamian tradition. Early translations, however, were often speculative and incomplete. Many tablets were fragmentary, their lines broken or effaced. Philologists labored to reconstruct missing passages by comparing parallel copies, a task complicated by the existence of multiple versions in Sumerian and Akkadian. Syntax, poetic structure, and idiomatic usage all posed formidable challenges. Words that seemed straightforward in one context shifted meaning in another. Metaphors depended on cultural conventions long lost. Thus, translation was not merely linguistic but anthropological, an attempt to enter the conceptual world of ancient Mesopotamia. By the turn of the 20th century, comparative philology had matured into a rigorous science. Institutions such as the University of Oxford, the British Museum, and the University of Pennsylvania established dedicated Assyriology departments. Scholars standardized transliteration systems and grammatical conventions, producing reference works like Delitska's Assyrisches Handwörterbuch and the monumental Chicago Assyrian Dictionary. This professionalization allowed for consistent translation and interpretation across the growing corpus of texts. The Epic of Gilgamesh, by now recognized as a composite narrative drawn from Sumerian and Akkadian sources, became a central focus of the discipline. Early 20th century renderings by scholars such as R. Campbell Thompson and E. Wallace Budge represented an important stage in recovery but retained Victorian literary inflections. Their translations imposed biblical diction and romantic tone, reflecting the intellectual climate of the time. Later generations pursued greater philological fidelity. Samuel Noah Kramer's mid-century research clarified the relationship between the Sumerian Gilgamesh poems and the Akkadian epic, while Thorkild Jacobson's studies emphasized the poem's existential themes within Mesopotamian theology. Each correction and reinterpretation brought the text closer to its original form and cultural context. Translation was also an act of reconstruction. Thousands of tablets discovered at different sites had to be collated into coherent sequences. Differences in handwriting, dialect, and provenance meant that each piece required individual study. Scholars reassembled fragments like pieces of an immense linguistic puzzle, reconstructing broken narratives line by line. The Pennsylvania tablet and Yale tablet, published in the early 20th century, illuminated large portions of the Old Babylonian version, while later finds confirmed the existence of a standard Babylonian recension compiled centuries afterward. Through this comparative process, modern editors produced composite editions, scholarly syntheses representing the best approximation of a lost original. By the mid-20th century, the academic tone surrounding Gilgamesh had shifted from sensational discovery to measured inquiry. The poem was no longer treated as a mere curiosity or biblical parallel, but as a work of art and philosophy. The decipherment of cuneiform had not only recovered a text, it had opened an entire field of human knowledge. Through translation and commentary, scholars reconstructed the intellectual world of Bronze Age Mesopotamia, its theology, kingship, and conception of mortality. This transformation from excavation to comprehension reflected a larger evolution in historical method. The early explorers had sought treasures. The later philologists sought understanding. Their disciplined patience, rather than romantic imagination, restored Gilgamesh's voice to the modern world. As the text took shape, so too did its cultural significance. The flood of Gilgamesh reached across faiths and centuries. When George Smith deciphered the 11th tablet of the Epic of Gilgamesh in 1872, he revealed a narrative that shook the foundations of biblical scholarship. The story of Utnapishtim, the righteous man forewarned by the gods, who built a great vessel to survive a divine deluge, bore unmistakable resemblance to the account of Noah in the book of Genesis. The parallel was too close to dismiss as coincidence. Both men released birds to find dry land, both made offerings after the waters subsided, and both received divine favor for preserving life. Yet the discovery raised profound questions. Did the Hebrew authors borrow from Babylonian tradition? Were both myths drawn from a shared, older Near Eastern source? Or did similar experiences of catastrophic flooding simply give rise to parallel legends across ancient cultures? The debate over these questions became one of the central inquiries of comparative religion and philology in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Scholars such as Friedrich Delitzsch and Hermann Gunkel argued that Mesopotamian mythology deeply influenced early Israelite literature. Their analyses of linguistic parallels and thematic structure suggested a process of cultural transmission during the Babylonian exile, when Jewish scribes would have encountered the Akkadian Atrahasis and Gilgamesh flood accounts. Others, including conservative theologians of the period, rejected the notion of literary dependence, asserting that the biblical story represented an independent divine revelation. The controversy, sometimes termed the Babel-Bibel debate, extended beyond academia, touching broader questions about revelation, myth, and the authority of sacred text. Philological research soon clarified the chronological sequence of the flood traditions. The Sumerian Ziusudra text from the early 2nd millennium BCE, followed by the Akkadian Atrahasis epic and the later Gilgamesh adaptation, all predated the Hebrew Genesis by many centuries. These Mesopotamian versions preserved a consistent structure: divine anger at human excess, the command to build a boat, survival through a deluge, and the subsequent covenant or renewal of life. The persistence of this narrative across multiple civilizations reflected both the ecological realities of Mesopotamia, where the unpredictable flooding of the Tigris and Euphrates shaped human existence, and the theological need to explain divine justice and human frailty. Beyond the flood episode, broader comparative studies revealed striking continuities between Mesopotamian myth and later religious and literary traditions. The creation narratives of Enuma Elish, the descent motifs in Inanna's descent to the underworld, and the wisdom dialogues of Babylonian theodicy all resonated with themes later developed in Hebrew, Greek, and even Christian literature. Scholars recognize that the Epic of Gilgamesh occupied a central position within this cultural network, a bridge linking mythic archetypes from the ancient Near East to the moral philosophies of the classical and biblical worlds. The poem's exploration of mortality, friendship, and divine human boundaries paralleled the existential concerns of texts far removed in time and language. Archaeological discoveries throughout the 20th century reinforced these interconnections. Excavations at sites such as Ugarit, Mari, and Ebla produced cuneiform archives revealing parallel traditions of divine councils, heroic quests, and sacred floods. Comparative linguistics demonstrated how Semitic and Sumerian mythological vocabularies interacted, often through translation and reinterpretation across imperial boundaries. Thus, the Epic of Gilgamesh was no longer viewed as an isolated masterpiece but as a node within an evolving web of shared mythic thought that extended from the Bronze Age into late antiquity. By the mid-20th century, comparative mythology had matured into a structured discipline. Scholars such as Joseph Campbell, Mircea Eliade, and later Jeffrey Tighe and Tikva Frymerkensky emphasized the archetypal dimensions of the Gilgamesh story, the hero's journey, the confrontation with mortality, and the search for transcendent meaning. The flood, once studied merely as a historical curiosity, came to be seen as a symbolic representation of cyclical destruction and renewal, reflecting humanity's attempt to comprehend divine order in a world of impermanence. The biblical parallels, far from diminishing the uniqueness of either text, illuminated the shared psychological and cultural patterns that underlie ancient mythmaking. In modern theology, the relationship between Gilgamesh and Genesis continues to inform discussions of revelation and mythic truth. The flood story serves as a lens through which to examine the transmission of moral and cosmological ideas across civilizations. Whether understood as direct influence or as independent reflection of universal experience, the narrative demonstrates that the peoples of Mesopotamia and the Levant grappled with the same existential questions: divine justice, human survival, and the meaning of moral order in a fragile world. Through this comparative study, the Epic of Gilgamesh transcended the boundaries of archaeology and philology. It became a key to understanding how humanity has continually sought to express its awareness of mortality through sacred narrative. The flood of Gilgamesh did not merely precede the flood of Noah. It revealed the shared spiritual landscape from which the earliest theologies arose. Beyond religion, scholars found in Gilgamesh a meditation on the human condition. From fragments of clay to high-resolution scans, the epic entered the digital age. By the late 20th century, the Epic of Gilgamesh had passed through a century of decipherment, translation, and reconstruction. What began as a handful of damaged tablets scattered across museum storerooms matured into one of the most thoroughly studied texts of the ancient world. The efforts of philologists, archaeologists, and digital humanists combined to create modern critical editions that now define the scholarly standard for the epic's form and meaning. The turning point came with the publication of comprehensive editions by leading Assyriologists such as Andrew George, Stephanie Daly, and Benjamin Foster. These works integrated decades of textual comparison and archaeological discovery, transforming the Epic of Gilgamesh from a partially understood relic into a coherent literary whole. George's The Babylonian Gilgamesh Epic, 2003, in particular became the definitive modern reference. It presented transliterations and translations of all known fragments, complete with commentary, grammatical notes, and apparatuses detailing textual variants. This academic rigor replaced earlier composite renderings with a transparent, verifiable framework, allowing scholars to trace the epic's evolution from Old Babylonian through Standard Babylonian recensions. The preparation of such editions required extraordinary precision. Each fragment, whether from Nineveh, Uar, Sippar, or Hattusa, was examined for handwriting style, dialect, and physical curvature to determine its possible placement within the tablet's original sequence. Hundreds of lines were reconstructed through collation with duplicates or parallels from later copies. The process resembled linguistic archaeology, restoring not only damaged words but the logic of ancient composition. By cross-referencing fragments from different archives, modern editors recovered much of the epic structure, including the once-missing sections of tablets 2, V, and 12. Stephanie Daly's translations, most notably in Myths from Mesopotamia, 1989, emphasized readability without sacrificing philological accuracy. Her work made the text accessible to broader audiences while preserving essential scholarly detail. Benjamin Foster's Before the Muses, 1993, revised 2005, positioned Gilgamesh within the wider canon of Akkadian literature, contextualizing the poem's themes among contemporaneous myths and royal inscriptions. Together, these editions reflected a balance between fidelity to the ancient text and engagement with the modern reader, a synthesis of academic precision and literary clarity. Parallel to textual scholarship, the late 20th and early 21st centuries witnessed a technological transformation in how ancient sources were studied and preserved. Digital imaging techniques, including reflectance transformation imaging, RTI, and 3D scanning, allowed curators to visualize incised signs invisible to the naked eye. High-resolution photography enabled remote analysis of tablets once accessible only to specialists with museum access. The digitization of cuneiform archives through initiatives such as the Cuneiform Digital Library Initiative, CDLI, the Electronic Text Corpus of Sumerian Literature, ETCSL, and the Open Richly Annotated Cuneiform Corpus, ORAC, revolutionized the field. For the first time, Global collaboration replaced the isolation of individual research, allowing scholars from multiple continents to reconstruct the epic collectively and transparently. These projects not only preserved fragile artifacts but democratized ancient knowledge. Each tablet, transliteration, and photograph became accessible through online databases, ensuring that no single institution held exclusive authority over interpretation. Artificial intelligence and machine learning tools now assist in fragment matching, predicting missing signs based on contextual probability. The epic, once pieced together through painstaking manual collation, now benefits from computational analysis that accelerates discoveries previously requiring decades. The standardization of textual data has also clarified the poem's canonical status. Today, academic editions converge on the structure of 12 tablets with a recognized prologue and epilogue, while acknowledging variant traditions from Old Babylonian and Hittite sources. Glossaries, sign lists, and digital indices continue to expand, providing the infrastructure for ongoing refinement. In classrooms and museums alike, the epic is now studied not only as literature but as a living dataset, an evolving record of ancient human expression reconstructed through modern technology. This digital preservation ensures that the Epic of Gilgamesh will survive long beyond the clay that first bore its words. What began as wedge-shaped impressions in river mud now exists as light on a screen, a transformation that mirrors the continuity of human memory itself. Scholars, curators, and readers alike participate in the epic's rebirth, ensuring that the voice of Gilgamesh endures in every new medium humanity creates. The revival of the text reignited interest in its timeless message. Gilgamesh's journey to find immortality became humanity's first philosophy of death. Long before Socrates asked what it means to live well, before Buddhist monks spoke of impermanence, the poets of Mesopotamia had already imagined a king who could not bear to die. In the clay tablets of Gilgamesh, mortality is not a curse inflicted upon humankind, but a truth that defines it. The epic stands as the earliest meditation on the limits of power and the meaning of wisdom, a recognition that to be human is to strive, to lose, and to remember. At the heart of the poem lies a paradox. Gilgamesh, 2/3 divine and 1/3 mortal, possesses strength beyond any man yet cannot escape death. His friendship with Enkidu becomes the mirror through which he confronts his own impermanence. When Enkidu dies, the great king who once scorned the gods is undone by grief. His lament, that he too will lie down and never rise, transforms him from conqueror to seeker. The journey that follows, through mountains, seas, and mythic lands, is not merely a quest for eternal life, but a search for meaning within the confines of human fate. The philosophy that emerges is profoundly humanistic. In the Mesopotamian worldview, the gods possess immortality, but their immortality does not make them wise, only distant. Mortals, by contrast, achieve understanding through suffering and acceptance. The poem's theological core suggests that wisdom comes from acknowledging limits, not denying them. Gilgamesh's failure to secure everlasting life is not tragedy but revelation. He learns that his true legacy lies in the walls of Uruk, the works of civilization, and the stories that bear his name. In this sense, Gilgamesh articulates one of the earliest known philosophies of civilization as immortality. The city, built by human hands, endures when flesh and kings decay. The opening lines, "He who saw the deep, the foundation of the land," remind readers that the hero's vision is both literal and symbolic. He has seen the depths of human experience and has returned to build. The poem thus redefines greatness. To see the deep is not to conquer or to defy the gods, but to understand life's brevity and create meaning in its shadow. The Mesopotamian poets used this narrative to reconcile divine order with human striving. In their cosmology, death was not punishment for sin but the natural boundary separating gods and men. Humanity's greatness lay in its creative response to that boundary, through building, storytelling, and moral reflection. Gilgamesh's transformation from tyrant to wise ruler models this moral evolution. His ultimate act of wisdom is not rebellion against the gods but acceptance of his place within their design. The The poem also offers a philosophy of memory as survival. When Utnapishtim tells Gilgamesh the story of the flood, he reveals that immortality was granted once, and only through divine exception. But the flood narrative serves another purpose. It demonstrates that remembrance, the recording of deeds, the inscription of words, allows mortals to outlast their span. Gilgamesh's name, carved into stone, becomes the very proof of his enlightenment. He cannot live forever, yet his story does. Modern interpreters have recognized in this insight a universal truth, that the human condition, defined by mortality, also compels the creation of culture, art, and ethics. In the epic, death is the teacher of meaning. Gilgamesh's encounter with the immortal flood survivor and his eventual return to Uruk represent a journey from ignorance to wisdom, from the illusion of divine power to the acceptance of human purpose. It is, in essence, a philosophical initiation, a movement from the fear of death to the understanding of life. In this light, the Epic of Gilgamesh anticipates many later traditions of existential thought. The Sumerian and Akkadian poets expressed in mythic form what later thinkers would express in reasoned discourse, that mortality defines value, and that the limits of life give rise to moral order. The insight that life, which you look for, you will never find, as Saduri tells Gilgamesh, is not despair but counsel. It urges joy in the daily acts of love, labor, and rest. Saduri's advice, to fill your belly, day and night be merry, is not hedonism, but an early articulation of balance, the first echo of what philosophers would later call the art of living. Thus, beneath its heroic imagery, Gilgamesh speaks in a philosophical voice. It is a reflection on how to live in full awareness of death, a theme that would later echo in the Stoics' acceptance of fate, in Ecclesiastes' wisdom literature, and in modern existentialism alike. The poem reminds us that all civilization, all knowledge, begins with the recognition of mortality. And in that recognition, humanity finds its deepest wisdom. Its wisdom would resonate through later civilizations. Two figures, one wild, one royal, define the boundaries of civilization. In the meeting of Gilgamesh and Enkidu, the Epic of Gilgamesh sets forth one of the earliest recorded meditations on human nature and moral order. Their relationship embodies the tension between the wilderness and the city, instinct and law, nature and culture, forces that every civilization must reconcile to define itself. Through their encounter, the poem explores how humanity transforms chaos into order, and how true kingship requires both strength and empathy. Enkidu is born of the wild. Created by the gods to balance Gilgamesh's arrogance, he first roams with animals, living by instinct and untouched by human custom. His strength is unshaped, his virtue untaught. When a hunter finds him and seeks the temple's aid, the priestess Shamhat is sent to civilize him. Through her, Enkidu experiences the defining acts of humanity, intimacy, food, and speech. The process that follows is not simply taming. It is transformation. Enkidu's separation from nature marks the passage from instinct to consciousness, from freedom to responsibility. Gilgamesh, by contrast, represents the culmination of human order, the ruler, builder, and lawgiver. Yet his tyranny at the story's beginning reveals the imbalance of a civilization detached from compassion. He wields the instruments of power without the wisdom to temper them. The gods' decision to create Enkidu is thus an act of cosmic correction, balancing the forces that sustain society. Their conflict, when they finally meet, is not personal but philosophical. When Enkidu challenges Gilgamesh, the confrontation between wilderness and kingship becomes the crucible through which each discovers his moral dimension. Their subsequent friendship transforms both. By journeying together to defeat Humbaba, the guardian of the cedar forest, they cross the boundaries that define the human world. In slaying Humbaba and later the Bull of Heaven, the two heroes assert human ambition against divine and natural limits, acts both courageous and transgressive. Yet the victories that once proved their strength lead to Enkidu's death, the divine punishment for their defiance. The lesson is clear. Civilization's mastery over nature carries moral consequence. The gods remind humankind that power, unrestrained by humility, endangers the balance of the world. Through this lens, the relationship between Gilgamesh and Enkidu serves as a philosophical allegory for the evolution of ethical kingship. Enkidu's humanity, gained through loss, awakens compassion in Gilgamesh. The wild man teaches the king what no throne or temple could, the knowledge of equality and mortality. Their friendship thus becomes the origin of justice, not as divine decree but as human understanding. The transformation of Gilgamesh from oppressor to wise ruler reflects the moral foundation upon which ancient political thought was built, that power requires empathy and that civilization is sustained by restraint. The dualism between the wild and the civilized is also a metaphor for the human condition. Every society negotiates the tension between instinct and order, emotion and reason, freedom and law. In Mesopotamian culture, this balance was mirrored in daily life, between the fertile rivers and the unpredictable floods, between divine favor and divine wrath. The Epic of Gilgamesh uses myth to articulate this equilibrium. To become fully human, one must acknowledge both the creative force of nature and the necessity of structure. This philosophical motif of the civilized man and his wild counterpart recurs across world mythologies. In Greek tradition, Heracles and his labors echo Gilgamesh's conquests, strength tempered through suffering. In Indian epics, the dialogue between the ascetic and the king expresses the same moral tension between withdrawal and engagement. Even in later Near Eastern and biblical literature, figures such as Esau and Jacob, Cain and Abel, preserve the archetype of the divided human nature, one attuned to the wild, the other to the law. By tracing these parallels, scholars recognize Gilgamesh as the earliest articulation of a universal theme, that civilization defines itself not merely through mastery of the natural world, but through moral self-awareness. The friendship between Gilgamesh and Enkidu stands as the first recorded vision of ethical humanism, the recognition that wisdom arises from encounter, from the meeting of opposites. Their story thus marks the turning point of the epic. Enkidu's death, while tragic, is the moment in which the hero's philosophy is born. In losing his friend, Gilgamesh gains self-knowledge. The wild and the royal, once adversaries, merge into a single human understanding, that greatness without compassion is emptiness, and that civilization, to endure, must remember its origins in the wild. This archetype would echo in myths from Greece to India. The gods of Mesopotamia ruled by fate, yet Gilgamesh sought meaning through action. In the theological landscape of ancient Mesopotamia, divine order governed every aspect of existence, from the flooding of rivers to the lifespan of kings. Humanity's role was not to question this hierarchy but to sustain it through ritual, labor, and obedience. Yet within the Epic of Gilgamesh, a subtle but profound departure emerges. The poem preserves the framework of divine justice, yet it introduces the possibility of human agency, the idea that meaning can be pursued, even within the boundaries of fate. In Mesopotamian cosmology, the gods maintained an ordered but indifferent universe. Each deity embodied a domain of existence. Anu ruled the heavens, Enlil the wind and decrees, Enki, the wisdom of the deep. Human beings were fashioned from clay and divine essence to serve the gods' needs, not their own aspirations. Mortality was their condition and their boundary. The afterlife, as described in the epic's final tablets, offered only a shadowed continuation, not reward or punishment. The concept of justice was thus collective, not personal, maintaining the balance between divine will and human duty. Gilgamesh's journey challenges this paradigm. His rebellion against mortality and his pursuit of wisdom represent an early articulation of human self-determination. While he cannot alter fate, he can seek understanding, a philosophical stance that anticipates later thought. His defiance does not arise from pride alone but from inquiry. Why must humanity die? What is the purpose of life within the order of the gods? These questions mark the epic's transformation from mythic narrative to reflective philosophy. When Enkidu dies, Gilgamesh confronts the problem of divine justice directly. Enkidu's punishment, decreed by the gods for slaying Humbaba and the bull of heaven, exposes the tension between moral intention and cosmic law. The heroes act out of courage and loyalty, yet they suffer for transgressing divine boundaries. Here the poem presents a distinctly Mesopotamian vision of justice. The gods preserve order, not fairness. Human virtue lies not in victory, but in comprehension, in accepting that divine logic transcends human desire. Still, Gilgamesh's response is revolutionary. Instead of submitting to despair, he embarks on a quest for immortality. His journey across the wilderness to find Utnapishtim, the flood survivor, represents the human effort to bridge the distance between mortality and divine eternity. Along the way, each encounter with the Scorpion Men, with Siduri the tavern keeper, with Urshanabi the ferryman, becomes an allegory for limits and choice. Siduri's counsel, preserved in several old Babylonian fragments, expresses one of the earliest philosophical exhortations in world literature. When the gods created man, they allotted him death, but life they retained in their own keeping. Fill your belly, be merry day and night, make every day a feast of joy. This passage conveys a distinctly humanist ethic. If immortality is denied, meaning must be found in the present. Siduri's words transform resignation into wisdom, an acceptance of finitude that anticipates Stoic and existential philosophies. Gilgamesh's failure to grasp the plant of eternal life is not defeat but revelation. Through loss, he gains understanding. The permanence of achievement lies not in body, but in creation and memory. Archaeological and textual studies reinforce how this theological shift mirrored broader Mesopotamian thought. By the late 2nd millennium BCE, wisdom literature such as the Dialogue of Pessimism and the Babylonian Theodicy questioned divine justice more openly. These works, like Gilgamesh, examined whether virtue guaranteed reward and whether fate could be understood through reason. In this way, the epic stands as a precursor to philosophical inquiry itself, not yet systematic but already reflective. The theological balance of the poem remains intact. The gods are supreme, yet the human search for meaning holds dignity. Gilgamesh learns that divine justice is immutable, but human agency lies in interpretation, in how one chooses to live within the limits imposed by the cosmos. The city walls of Uruk, which frame the epic's closing lines, become the tangible expression of this insight. Though mortal, Gilgamesh's legacy endures through human labor and collective memory. Civilization itself becomes the vessel of immortality. This conception of divine order and human striving would resonate far beyond Mesopotamia. In later Greek philosophy, the notion that wisdom arises from accepting mortality echoes through Heraclitus and later in Stoic ethics. The Epic of Gilgamesh anticipates this moral stance by millennia, not through abstract reasoning, but through narrative demonstration. Its theology remains polytheistic, yet its message is humanist. Even in a world ruled by gods, the meaning of existence must be sought by mortals themselves. Thus, the epic articulates one of the earliest recorded syntheses of theology and philosophy. Divine justice sets the boundaries. Human agency fills them with purpose. Gilgamesh, though he fails to attain eternal life, becomes the model for all later seekers of wisdom, those who act not to defy the gods, but to understand the order they represent. The world's first hero thus became its first philosopher. Across the ancient Near East, echoes of Gilgamesh shaped the myths of nations. The epic's philosophical and narrative motifs, divine justice, the search for immortality, the friendship of opposites, transcended the borders of Sumer and Babylon to influence the mythic imagination of neighboring cultures. From Ugarit on the Levantine coast to Hattusa in Anatolia and Jerusalem in the highlands of Canaan, fragments of the Gilgamesh worldview reappeared in altered forms. The transmission was not direct imitation, but cultural diffusion, the gradual movement of ideas through scribal exchange, trade, and conquest. In tracing these parallels, scholars reconstruct a shared intellectual landscape that stretched across the Near Eastern world during the 2nd and 1st millennia BCE. The Ugaritic corpus, discovered at Ras Shamra, modern-day Ugarit, Syria, provides one of the clearest cases of this diffusion. Composed in a northwest Semitic dialect around the 13th century BCE, Ugaritic myths such as the Baal cycle reveal striking thematic affinities with Gilgamesh. Both depict divine-human interaction within an ordered cosmos governed by decree, and both treat kingship as both gift and burden. The storm god Baal, like Gilgamesh, struggles against the inevitability of death and the cyclical nature of time. The descent motif, central to Gilgamesh's journey to Utnapishtim, finds its parallel in Baal's descent to the underworld and subsequent return, a narrative exploring renewal through loss. While direct literary borrowing is unlikely, the structural similarity attests to a shared Mesopotamian intellectual substrate that informed West Semitic theology. In Anatolia, Hittite and Hurrian literature further attest to the spread of Mesopotamian mythic themes. Cuneiform archives at Hattusa contain adaptations of Sumerian and Akkadian compositions, including partial versions of the Gilgamesh epic. One notable fragment, preserved in Hittite translation, recounts elements of Gilgamesh's journey and his confrontation with mortality. Its presence within royal libraries of the 14th and 13th centuries BCE demonstrates the prestige of Mesopotamian literature beyond its linguistic homeland. The Hittite scribal class, multilingual and cosmopolitan, treated Babylonian texts as vehicles of wisdom and legitimacy, much as Greek scholars would later study Homer. Hebrew literature, though emerging centuries later, also bears traces of this broader Near Eastern inheritance. The flood narrative of Genesis 6-9 parallels the account of Utnapishtim in Tablet 11 of the Epic of Gilgamesh, both derived ultimately from the Akkadian Atrahasis tradition. In each, divine judgment manifests through a deluge, a single righteous figure preserves life, and a covenant marks the renewal of the world. The theological differences, however, reveal the transformation of Mesopotamian myth into ethical monotheism. In Gilgamesh, the gods act capriciously, whereas in Genesis, divine justice follows moral order. Yet the underlying human question, the fragility of life under divine decree, remains constant. Other Hebrew texts preserve subtler resonances. The Book of Ecclesiastes, with its reflection that there is nothing new under the sun, echoes the existential resignation voiced by Siduri. Likewise, the Psalms' praise of human works as the path to remembrance parallels Gilgamesh's concluding insight that the walls of Uruk, products of labor and artistry, constitute his true immortality. Such parallels do not imply direct borrowing but rather shared engagement with the same ancient questions. What is justice under divine sovereignty? What endures beyond death? These intersections demonstrate that Gilgamesh was not a static text confined to a vanished civilization but a dynamic component of the ancient Near Eastern intellectual continuum. Its philosophical core, the tension between fate and human aspiration, reappeared wherever scribes grappled with mortality and meaning. Clay tablets carried not only language but worldview. With each translation or adaptation, the Mesopotamian heritage evolved into new cultural forms. By the early 1st millennium BCE, these mythic elements had become part of a regional vocabulary of wisdom and theology. Assyrian emissaries, Babylonian merchants, and Aramaic scribes all contributed to this exchange, spreading literary motifs across linguistic and political boundaries. The result was not uniformity but resonance, a chorus of traditions responding to the same enduring concerns. The motif of the mortal hero traveled farther still, into the Mediterranean world. From Uruk's walls to Troy's battlements, the hero's struggle remained the same. The Epic of Gilgamesh and the literature of classical Greece are separated by more than a millennium, yet their heroes share a striking kinship of spirit. Across the long arc of antiquity, the Mesopotamian vision of the flawed but striving mortal reemerged in new cultural forms, reshaped by Hellenic values but rooted in the same inquiry into fate, virtue, and mortality. Though there is no evidence of direct literary transmission, the continuity of archetypes and philosophical questions reveals a deep, trans-civilizational dialogue about the human condition. The first parallel appears in Hercules, whose labors and divine heritage recall Gilgamesh's dual nature as part god, part man. Both heroes exhibit extraordinary strength paired with moral imperfection. Each undertakes a series of trials that test not only physical power but ethical endurance. Heracles' slaying of monsters, the Nemean lion, the Hydra, The Erymanthian boar mirrors Gilgamesh's confrontations with Humbaba and the Bull of Heaven. These acts of conquest, however, are not merely feats of violence. They symbolize humanity's assertion of order over chaos, civilization over the wild. Yet both figures face the consequences of their ambition. Heracles' madness and ultimate apotheosis reflect a reconciliation between mortal suffering and divine order, the same reconciliation that Gilgamesh seeks through the wisdom of Utnapishtim. Achilles, the hero of Homer's Iliad, embodies another aspect of the Gilgameshian archetype, the confrontation with mortality as the measure of meaning. Like Gilgamesh, Achilles is aware of his limited lifespan and chooses glory over longevity. The Iliad transforms this recognition into tragic awareness, that even the greatest warrior cannot escape the universal fate of death. When Achilles mourns Patroclus, the emotional depth of his grief parallels Gilgamesh's lament for Enkidu. Both epics pivot on the death of a companion whose loss awakens the hero's humanity. The result is transformation. Achilles' wrath gives way to compassion, just as Gilgamesh's arrogance yields to wisdom. This thematic bridge between Gilgamesh and the Iliad has drawn scholarly attention since the 20th century, particularly through comparative analysis of oral tradition. Both poems evolved from centuries of performance and adaptation, reflecting collective memory more than individual authorship. In each case, the epic becomes a vehicle for moral reflection, what it means to be human under the constraints of divine will. The shared motifs of divine intervention, heroic friendship, and the cost of glory suggest that the heroic code, valor tempered by awareness of mortality, was a universal construct of early literate civilizations. A further parallel arises in Odysseus, the wandering hero of the Odyssey. His journey, defined by exile, endurance, and the pursuit of knowledge, closely resembles Gilgamesh's post-Enkidu quest. Both heroes traverse the edges of the known world, encountering supernatural beings that test their wisdom. Odysseus' descent to the underworld mirrors Gilgamesh's encounter with Utnapishtim beyond the waters of death. Each learns that true fulfillment lies not in divine secrets but in human continuity. Odysseus through homecoming and family, Gilgamesh through the enduring legacy of Uruk. Both narratives thus redefine heroism as understanding rather than conquest. Archaeological and linguistic evidence suggests that the Eastern Mediterranean was a zone of significant cultural interaction during the Late Bronze Age. The Akkadian and Hittite tablets that preserved Gilgamesh circulated in regions connected to Mycenaean trade networks. While direct transmission remains uncertain, the conceptual exchange of mythic themes, flood legends, divine retribution, the heroic quest, was almost inevitable within this milieu. The Greeks, like their Mesopotamian predecessors, used myth to articulate the boundaries of human potential and divine authority. Philosophically, both traditions converge on a key principle: the pursuit of wisdom through suffering. In Mesopotamian thought, knowledge arises from confronting limitation. In Greek philosophy, it becomes the foundation of virtue. The Delphic maxim, "Know thyself," finds an antecedent in Gilgamesh's recognition of his mortality. Similarly, the Stoic understanding of fate and acceptance, articulated by later thinkers such as Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius, resonates with the existential humility that concludes the Epic of Gilgamesh. The hero's acceptance of death as the condition of meaning anticipates the moral outlook that underpins classical ethics. Even stylistically, parallels exist. The narrative structure of the epic, quest, loss, revelation, return, became the blueprint for later heroic literature. Scholars such as W.G. Lambert and Svea Bush have noted that Gilgamesh's transformation from action to understanding marks the earliest expression of what would later become the Aristotelian recognition, anagnorisis, the moment when knowledge replaces ignorance and restores balance. This intellectual continuity underscores the epic's place not only in Near Eastern literature but in the genealogy of Western thought. Thus, while separated by language, geography, and religion, Gilgamesh, Heracles, Achilles, and Odysseus form a continuous lineage of heroic philosophy. Each stands at the intersection of myth and morality, figures through whom civilizations define their ideals and limits. Their struggles against mortality and the gods embody the same paradox. That greatness lies not in transcending human bounds but in understanding them. Centuries later, his spirit would find new forms in world literature. The questions Gilgamesh asked would later define philosophy itself. What is a good life? How should mortals live knowing they must die? From the river valleys of Mesopotamia to the schools of Athens and Rome, this tension between finitude and meaning became the foundation of human thought. Though the philosophers of the classical world never read the Epic of Gilgamesh, the moral architecture it established, the search for wisdom within limitation, would echo through their inquiries into virtue, reason, and the nature of the soul. At its heart, the Epic of Gilgamesh is an early form of existential reflection. Gilgamesh's journey begins in hubris and ends in self-knowledge, a movement from the illusion of control to acceptance of mortality. This intellectual transformation anticipates the central insight of later philosophy, that understanding death is essential to understanding life. When Gilgamesh abandons his futile quest for eternal youth and instead praises the lasting works of humanity, the walls of Uruk, he articulates a proto-humanist creed. Meaning, he realizes, lies not in defying death but in creating something that endures beyond it. This notion of transcendence through legacy, rather than through the divine, forms the moral bridge to Greek and Roman philosophy. The Stoics, for example, would later define virtue as living in harmony with the order of nature, an idea that resonates with Gilgamesh's final acceptance of his place within the cosmic order. The Stoic sage, like Gilgamesh, learns serenity not by conquering fate but by aligning himself with it. Marcus Aurelius' meditations could almost serve as a commentary on the Sumerian king's transformation. You could leave life right now. Let that determine what you do and say and think. The voice of Uruk's king, once proud, then humbled, speaks through that same quiet resolve. The Epicureans, too, share an unexpected kinship with the ancient poem. For Epicurus, peace of mind arises from understanding the natural limits of life and dismissing fear of the gods and death. Gilgamesh's despair at Enkidu's death mirrors the irrational terror Epicurus would later diagnose, the refusal to accept mortality as natural. Only when Gilgamesh ceases his pursuit of divine secrets and embraces mortal joy does he find the contentment the Epicureans called ataraxia. In both traditions, philosophy replaces divine petition with self-knowledge. In the Hellenistic world, moral philosophy evolved into a kind of secular theology, an effort to find human meaning in a cosmos governed by impersonal forces. Here again, the Mesopotamian epic stands as a precursor. The gods of Gilgamesh are capricious, distant, and often indifferent. They represent not moral ideals but the structure of existence itself. Humanity's task, then, is to live wisely within that structure, to seek justice, friendship, and creativity despite uncertainty. This same attitude would underlie early humanism, the belief that dignity arises from the exercise of human faculties rather than divine favor. Even Plato's dialogues echo fragments of the Gilgameshian vision. In the Phaedo, Socrates argues that philosophy is a preparation for death. His calm acceptance before execution mirrors Gilgamesh's final composure at the gates of Uruk. Both figures achieve enlightenment through confrontation with mortality. Likewise, in the Symposium, Plato's account of love as the pursuit of immortality through creation, whether through children, virtue, or art, parallels Gilgamesh's realization that his city's walls and stories will outlast him. The Sumerian king's revelation thus prefigures a philosophical anthropology, that humanity's greatness lies in imagination, memory, and craft. By the Roman period, these currents coalesced into a distinctly human-centered ethics. Thinkers like Cicero and Seneca emphasized moral duty, civic virtue, and the cultivation of inner peace, ideas rooted not in divine command but in human reason. Though their intellectual lineage traced through Greece, their moral posture, noble resignation before fate, had been lived already by Gilgamesh. Through this continuity, the ancient poem becomes not merely literature but philosophy in embryo, a vision of humanity seeking wisdom in a world ruled by death. Modern scholars such as Jean Bottero and Andrew George have described the Epic of Gilgamesh as the first humanist text, a work that shifts focus from divine law to mortal experience. It teaches that the measure of life is not duration but depth. Civilization, friendship, and creativity stand as bulwarks against oblivion. The epic's final message, that immortality belongs to culture, not the body, anticipates every later humanist creed, from the Stoics to the Renaissance. Thus, long before Socrates or Seneca, Gilgamesh posed the questions that would define philosophical inquiry. How should we live? What endures when we die? What makes a life worthy of remembrance? In modernity, those questions still endure. From museum halls to classrooms, Gilgamesh once more became a household name. What had begun as fragments of clay in the ruins of Nineveh soon ignited the imagination of a century poised between faith and science. As scholars pieced together the Epic of Gilgamesh, the public glimpsed, for the first time, the voice of a civilization older than Abraham and older than Homer. It was not merely an archaeological marvel. It was a revelation that human thought, poetry, and anguish had taken form thousands of years before the Bible or the Greeks. The early 20th century witnessed the cultural rebirth of Gilgamesh through a combination of academic rigor and popular fascination. The first English translations, circulated in journals and later in general publications, gave readers access to a world long buried under Mesopotamian dust. Newspapers and illustrated magazines reported each discovery with awe. Museums displayed the tablets as relics of humanity's first book. For a public entranced by archaeology, from Egypt's tombs to Babylon's ruins, Gilgamesh symbolized the dawn of civilization itself. In the interwar years, the Epic of Gilgamesh gained a prominent place in the dialogue between archaeology, theology, and education. The flood narrative, echoing the story of Noah, provoked intense debate among theologians and scholars. Was this proof that biblical traditions drew from earlier Mesopotamian sources? Or was it a sign of a shared, universal memory of catastrophe? For religious and secular thinkers alike, the epic blurred the boundaries between revelation and record, between sacred myth and human memory. The clay tablets from Nineveh became touchstones for a new understanding of how stories evolve, and how civilizations borrow, reshape, and preserve truth through language. Meanwhile, educators and philologists began to recognize Gilgamesh as a cornerstone of world literature. Universities in Europe and America introduced the epic into curricula on ancient history and comparative mythology. In these settings, the poem served not only as a text to be analyzed but as a symbol of cultural continuity, proof that the human search for meaning, love, and immortality transcends eras and empires. To study Gilgamesh was to rediscover the origins of narrative itself. The translation movement of the early 20th century further extended the epic's reach. Scholars such as George Smith, R. Campbell Thompson, and later Samuel Noah Kramer and A. Heidel offered versions accessible to both specialists and lay readers. Their work captured the imagination of a world recovering from industrialization and war, an age searching for moral and emotional depth amid rapid change. In Gilgamesh's lament for Enkidu, readers found an ancient mirror for modern grief. In his futile quest for eternal life, they recognized their own struggle with meaning in a secular century. By the 1930s and 1940s, the epic had entered the broader public imagination. Archaeological exhibitions drew large crowds. Newspapers referred to Gilgamesh alongside Moses and Achilles as one of the great heroes of antiquity. Popular writers and educators invoked him as the first human hero. Not divine, not perfect, but striving and flawed. The poem's rediscovery resonated with an age marked by the collapse of empires and the questioning of traditional certainties. Humanity, again, sought wisdom in the ruins of the past. In this context, Gilgamesh became more than an archaeological artifact. He became a symbol of continuity, proof that civilization could endure even when cities fell and languages vanished. The tablets, once buried beneath the ruins of Nineveh, now stood as emblems of endurance through knowledge. Museums curated them not merely as antiquities, but as witnesses to humanity's first recorded thoughts about mortality and meaning. The period from 1900 to 1950 thus marked the epic's passage from obscurity to universality. Scholars illuminated its context, theologians debated its implications, educators spread its lessons. The name Gilgamesh, once known only to scribes in ancient Uruk, now appeared in classrooms, libraries, and public lectures across continents. Long after his reign, the king who saw the deep had returned, not as conqueror or demigod, but as a voice of shared humanity. His story, once impressed upon clay by anonymous scribes, was now impressed upon the modern conscience. Writers and artists soon found their own reflections in the ancient king. Modern storytellers found in Gilgamesh the prototype of all narrative quests. As the 20th century advanced, the rediscovered epic began to move beyond the walls of academia. What had once been the province of philologists and archaeologists now became a source of inspiration for poets, novelists, dramatists, and visual artists. Gilgamesh, the ancient king of Uruk, ceased to be merely a historical figure. He emerged as a literary archetype, a timeless mirror reflecting humanity's search for meaning, companionship, and transcendence. The post-war decades marked a period of profound reinterpretation. After the devastation of two world wars, writers sought stories that could reconcile human suffering with endurance. The Epic of Gilgamesh, with its meditation on mortality and friendship, provided a model for expressing these universal concerns. German poet Rainer Maria Rilke, in his reflections on death and the creative spirit, saw in Gilgamesh a figure who wrestled with loss, yet achieved understanding through art and remembrance. Similarly, the Austrian writer Hermann Brock and others within the European existential tradition treated the epic as a prefiguration of modern consciousness, the recognition that meaning must be created within a transient world. In the English-speaking world, the influence of Gilgamesh extended through poetry and literary modernism. Translators and poets such as John Gardner, N.K. Sandars, and later Stephen Mitchell shaped renderings that emphasized the poem's emotional and psychological dimensions. The cadence of Akkadian verse, adapted into modern free verse, gave rise to a new poetic vocabulary of loss and discovery. These translations, often combining scholarship with literary craft, made the epic accessible to general audiences while retaining its philosophical depth. Beyond literature, the visual arts began to reclaim Mesopotamian themes. Sculptors and painters in the mid-20th century drew upon the imagery of cuneiform tablets and reliefs, interpreting them through the lens of abstraction and modernism. Artists such as Anselm Kiefer and Arshil Gorky, though not directly illustrating the Gilgamesh narrative, incorporated motifs of decay, memory, and endurance reminiscent of the epic's tone. In these works, Uruk's walls became metaphors for civilization itself, enduring yet eroded, ancient yet perpetually renewed. During the late 20th century, the epic entered global literary discourse. Writers from diverse cultures found in Gilgamesh a framework for examining identity and the human condition. The American author Ursula K. Le Guin, in her essay The Carrier Bag Theory of Fiction, and her later works, cited ancient epics as formative myths of storytelling, with Gilgamesh representing the earliest journey from conflict to reflection. In her novella Paradises Lost, echoes of Gilgamesh's quest for meaning in a vast, uncaring cosmos parallel the Mesopotamian hero's futile pursuit of immortality. Meanwhile, Middle Eastern writers reclaimed Gilgamesh as part of their cultural heritage. Iraqi poet Badr Shakir al-Sayyab invoked the figure as a symbol of national and existential renewal in the aftermath of colonialism and war. In these reinterpretations, Gilgamesh ceased to belong solely to the ancient world. He became a vehicle for expressing resilience amid historical upheaval. The poem's themes of death, destruction, and renewal resonated with modern experiences of displacement and recovery. Academic and artistic collaborations also flourished. The late 20th century saw performances, operas, and theatrical adaptations that blended scholarship with creative expression. Composers such as Bohuslav Martinu and Charles Wuorinen drew inspiration from the epic structure and rhythm, translating its emotional progression into musical form. Stage productions reimagined Gilgamesh's friendship with Enkidu through psychological and symbolic interpretations, presenting the ancient tale as both myth and moral inquiry. The rise of comparative mythology further amplified the epic's relevance. Scholars and writers recognized Gilgamesh not simply as a Mesopotamian artifact but as a foundation for narrative psychology and the study of archetypes. Joseph Campbell's concept of the hero's journey, though developed primarily from later traditions, aligns closely with the structure of Gilgamesh's Odyssey. The call to adventure, the confrontation with mortality, and the return bearing wisdom. Modern authors, consciously or not, continued to trace this ancient path in their own creations, from T. Eliot's fragmented modernist poetry to the science fiction epics of the late 20th century. By the dawn of the 21st century, Gilgamesh had become a universal literary symbol. His quest for immortality, originally inscribed on clay tablets, now appeared in novels, films, and digital media. Artists and authors continued to reinterpret the epic as a meditation on memory, mortality, and human legacy. The endurance of the story demonstrated not only the survival of text but the adaptability of myth. How a poem composed 4,000 years ago could speak directly to the anxieties and aspirations of the modern world. Thus, the figure of Gilgamesh bridged the ancient and contemporary, the scholarly and creative, the archaeological and psychological. In each adaptation, whether Rilke's philosophical verse, Le Guin's speculative narrative, or a modern sculptor's reimagining, the epic's essence remained. A confrontation between mortality and meaning. Through art and literature, the story continued to evolve, reaffirming its place not as a relic, but as a living tradition of thought. Even in popular media, the ancient epic continues to speak. For 1,000 years later, the king of Uruk still searches for what it means to be human. The Epic of Gilgamesh has become more than literature. It is a mirror reflecting the enduring concerns of human civilization. Across millennia, readers have returned to the story to grapple with mortality, friendship, leadership, and the pursuit of meaning. The epic's survival, from clay tablets buried in Mesopotamian ruins to digital editions and global translations, attests to its centrality in shaping cultural memory and human identity. In the modern era, scholars and educators have positioned Gilgamesh as a foundational text for understanding humanism. Unlike many mythologies focused primarily on divine agency, the epic emphasizes human choice, effort, and creativity. Gilgamesh's realization that his city's walls and the story of his deeds constitute a form of immortality underscores the humanist principle. Legacy arises from human action rather than divine favor. This focus on agency, combined with the unavoidable reality of death, forms a philosophical anchor for discussions on ethics, purpose, and the responsibilities of leadership. The narrative also remains central in the study of mortality and grief. The death of Enkidu, which propels Gilgamesh's quest, illustrates the universality of loss and the transformative power of mourning. Modern psychology and literary studies often reference this episode when exploring the universality of grief, the construction of heroism, and the confrontation with existential anxiety. In these contexts, the epic serves as a tool for understanding how early societies conceptualized the limits of life and the methods by which individuals and communities sought to endure emotionally and culturally. Additionally, the epic engages with questions of civilization versus nature, which retain contemporary relevance. The contrast between Gilgamesh, the urban king, and Enkidu, the wild man, highlights the interplay between societal norms and innate human impulses. Modern scholars interpret this relationship as an early discourse on identity formation, social responsibility, and ethical governance. In literary and philosophical studies, the dynamic between these two figures provides insight into how ancient societies negotiated the tensions between instinct, social order, and the ethical responsibilities of rulers and citizens alike. The enduring relevance of Gilgamesh is further reinforced through global literature and media, where its themes resonate with contemporary concerns. Writers, filmmakers, and digital storytellers continue to explore mortality, friendship, and the quest for knowledge through echoes of the epic. From novels inspired by the journey of the hero to interactive media invoking exploration, danger, and ethical choice, Gilgamesh functions as a narrative prototype. The epic's structural and thematic motifs have become part of a shared cultural vocabulary, enabling audiences to confront timeless questions within new forms and technologies. From a historical perspective, the epic's archival preservation underscores the fragility and resilience of human memory. Surviving the collapse of civilizations, the loss of cuneiform literacy, and centuries of obscurity, the story demonstrates the capacity of texts to endure and to transmit human concerns across time. Archaeological rediscovery in the 19th and 20th centuries, combined with philological reconstruction, transformed Gilgamesh from a buried artifact into a living symbol of the human struggle to understand mortality and meaning. Through its narrative, Gilgamesh also fosters ethical reflection. His limitations and failures, juxtaposed with moments of courage, wisdom, and compassion, invite readers to consider the balance between ambition and humility, the value of friendship, and the pursuit of knowledge within human bounds. These reflections are not purely academic. They influence pedagogy, literary criticism, and public engagement with history and myth. The epic thereby serves as a bridge connecting ancient ethical thought to contemporary moral and philosophical inquiry. In sum, the Epic of Gilgamesh endures because it addresses questions that remain fundamentally human. It examines the tension between mortality and aspiration, the meaning of friendship and leadership, and the ways human beings seek permanence in an impermanent world. Its preservation in scholarship, literature, and public imagination ensures that the story remains a living part of cultural memory, continually shaping conceptions of identity, ethics, and existential understanding. From myth to manuscript, the journey nears its conclusion. Before Homer or the Bible, there was Gilgamesh. As the earliest known epic, the Epic of Gilgamesh occupies a unique position in the history of literature. Composed over 4 millennia ago and preserved through centuries of cuneiform tablets, it represents the first extended exploration of human experience in written form. The narrative combines myth, history, and philosophy, presenting a structured reflection on leadership, mortality, friendship, and the human quest for meaning. For scholars, it offers a window into the intellectual and cultural life of early Bronze Age Mesopotamia, while for educators, it provides a foundational text for understanding the evolution of narrative and literary technique. The epic's scholarly significance extends across multiple disciplines. Philologists analyze the poem's Akkadian and Sumerian layers to reconstruct historical linguistics and scribal practices. Archaeologists contextualize the tablets within the broader material culture of Uruk, Nineveh, and Babylon, shedding light on urbanization, administration, and ritual life. Literary historians trace its themes and structures, noting parallels with later epics, from Homeric Greece to the Sanskrit Mahabharata. In each field, Gilgamesh functions as a benchmark, the first point from which subsequent literary traditions can be measured and understood. Educationally, the epic has been central to the study of world literature and comparative mythology. Its inclusion in curricula demonstrates the continuity of human concern across time and space. Students encounter the earliest known reflections on friendship, grief, and human aspiration, offering both historical perspective and philosophical insight. The epic's narrative structure, with its episodic quests, trials, and ethical reflections, provides a model for storytelling, influencing not only literary composition but also the analytical frameworks through which literature is studied. From a literary standpoint, the Epic of Gilgamesh introduces fundamental narrative devices that recur throughout history. The hero's journey, the archetype of the companion or wild man, and the exploration of mortality and legacy all first appear here in a fully articulated form. These devices provide a template for subsequent literature, demonstrating that even at its earliest stage, writing served both as documentation and as a medium for reflection on the human condition. Gilgamesh thus functions as a primordial mirror, reflecting humanity's earliest attempts to record experience, understand the world, and communicate across generations. The epic's philosophical depth further reinforces its foundational status. Gilgamesh's recognition of human limitation, his grappling with loss, and his eventual acceptance of mortality anticipate the central concerns of later ethical and existential thought. Scholars identify continuity between the epic and philosophical traditions, including Stoicism, Epicureanism, and early humanism. Its preservation allows modern readers to trace the emergence of reflective thought, the systematic examination of life, society, and individual purpose, to one of humanity's first literate civilizations. The enduring influence of Gilgamesh is evident in both historical and contemporary scholarship. Translations, critical editions, and interdisciplinary studies continue to illuminate its narrative complexity and thematic sophistication. Through modern philology and archaeology, researchers reconstruct its composition, its transmission across languages, and its role within the social and religious structures of ancient Mesopotamia. In doing so, they affirm the epic status as the progenitor of literary tradition, a work whose technical, thematic, and philosophical innovations set the standard for subsequent texts. Yet the epic's value is not limited to academia. Its narratives speak to universal human concerns, allowing readers across cultures and eras to engage with the challenges of mortality, friendship, and governance. The story's survival through time underscores the enduring power of literature to communicate core aspects of human identity, offering both insight into the ancient world and a mirror for contemporary reflection. Yet its true legacy extends beyond words, into the idea of civilization itself. The story of Gilgamesh is the story of civilization remembering itself. Beyond its literary and philosophical significance, the Epic of Gilgamesh serves as a profound symbol of cultural endurance. From the clay tablets of Uruk and Nineveh to modern translations and digital archives, the epic demonstrates how knowledge, values, and narratives can transcend the destruction of cities, the loss of languages, and the collapse of empires. Through this lens, Gilgamesh embodies the broader trajectory of civilization. Human societies build, destroy, remember, and reinterpret, ensuring that core insights endure across generations. The preservation of the epic across millennia highlights the mechanisms by which culture perpetuates itself through textual transmission. Ancient scribes, trained in specialized schools, meticulously copied tablets, preserving linguistic, narrative, and theological details. Even as Sumerian declined and Akkadian became dominant, the story survived through bilingual scribal practices. In later Assyria, the library of Ashurbanipal collected and standardized the text, demonstrating a conscious effort by one civilization to safeguard the intellectual heritage of its predecessors. Such preservation reflects a broader principle. The endurance of knowledge relies on deliberate acts of transmission and institutional memory. Archaeology and philology illuminate how Gilgamesh functioned as a repository of civic and moral ideals. The tale conveys not only the adventures of a king, but also the social, political, and religious norms of Mesopotamian urban life. Walls, temples, and administrative structures within the epic correspond to real urban and civic achievements, demonstrating the link between narrative and material civilization. By encoding these elements into story, the ancient poets ensured that subsequent generations could access and internalize cultural norms, even after the physical cities and their monuments had decayed. In this sense, the epic operates as a metaphor for human continuity. Gilgamesh's quest for immortality, initially literal and personal, transforms over time into a representation of cultural immortality. Through literature, memory, and collective knowledge, human achievements persist. Each clay tablet, translation, and scholarly study reinforces the principle that civilization's essence is recorded in ideas as much as in stone. The epic exemplifies the ways societies remember themselves, linking individual experience to collective identity. The modern rediscovery of Gilgamesh further underscores the dynamic between loss and recovery in human culture. Following centuries of obscurity after the fall of Babylon and Nineveh, scholars reconstructed the text from fragmented tablets. The act of translation and interpretation mirrors the epic's own themes. The attempt to preserve meaning, confront mortality, and achieve continuity. Each recovered fragment represents not just a story, but a bridge between past and present, a tangible manifestation of civilization remembering itself despite millennia of interruption. The epic also provides a framework for understanding intercultural transmission and adaptation. Its narrative influenced subsequent Mesopotamian literature, biblical traditions, Greek hero myths, and, ultimately, global literary forms. The motifs of friendship, mortality, and the quest for wisdom were carried forward through successive cultures, illustrating how civilizations absorb and reinterpret earlier knowledge. Through Gilgamesh, modern readers can trace a lineage of ideas, demonstrating that human societies are cumulative, building upon the intellectual and moral labor of their predecessors. Moreover, Gilgamesh exemplifies the ethical dimensions of collective memory. By immortalizing lessons about leadership, friendship, and mortality, the epic functions as a didactic instrument, guiding both rulers and citizens. Ancient audiences understood the narrative as a model for behavior and reflection. Modern audiences recognize its ethical resonance in contemporary debates about legacy, sustainability, and human responsibility. In this dual capacity, as artifact and moral text, the epic bridges the temporal distance between ancient and modern societies. Ultimately, the enduring relevance of Gilgamesh underscores the centrality of storytelling to civilization itself. While kings fall, empires dissolve, and languages vanish, narratives preserve collective insight. The epic demonstrates that the essence of civilization lies not merely in physical structures, but in the ideas, ethics, and experiences that communities choose to record and transmit. In doing so, the text ensures that the voices of the past continue to inform and shape the present. In this, Gilgamesh achieves the immortality he once sought. Through the persistence of narrative, culture, and collective memory, the king of Uruk transcends mortality, embodying the enduring legacy of civilization itself. What stone and empire could not preserve, the written word has. The Epic of Gilgamesh, once buried beneath millennia of sand and silence, now stands as a testament to the enduring power of human expression. Clay tablets that survived the collapse of cities and the decay of languages have become the conduits through which modern readers confront questions as old as civilization itself. Mortality, friendship, leadership, and the search for meaning. The rediscovery and study of the epic demonstrate that while material empires are impermanent, the ideas they produce can achieve a lasting presence. Scholarship has been central to this revival. From the earliest decipherments in the 19th century to contemporary philological, archaeological, and digital projects, scholars have painstakingly reconstructed the narrative. Each tablet fragment, each line of Akkadian, and each cross-referenced Sumerian text has contributed to a fuller understanding of the epic's structure, themes, and cultural context. Through methodical translation and interpretation, researchers have ensured that the insights of a civilization 4,000 years old continue to inform and resonate with contemporary audiences. The epic's thematic depth remains striking. Gilgamesh's confrontation with death, his grief over Enkidu, and his eventual acceptance of human limitation continue to offer a lens through which modern readers reflect on their own lives. Philosophers and literary critics alike recognize the story as an early exploration of existential questions. How to live knowing that life is finite, how to find value in friendship and community, and how to seek lasting significance through human endeavor. These reflections, first encoded in the earliest literature of Mesopotamia, continue to structure debates about ethics, leadership, and the human condition. Beyond academic circles, Gilgamesh has influenced broader cultural consciousness. Modern literature, theater, and visual arts draw upon its motifs, while educators introduce the epic to successive generations as a primary example of narrative thought. The story of a king striving to understand his place in the cosmos transcends historical boundaries, allowing readers worldwide to engage with the universality of its concerns. Through the epic, the earliest known narrative continues to cultivate empathy, moral insight, and intellectual curiosity. The preservation of Gilgamesh underscores the broader significance of writing itself. Physical monuments erode, empires rise and fall, languages die. Yet through written text, ideas can survive, travel across cultures, and persist across time. Gilgamesh demonstrates that literature is not merely a record of events but a vessel for human reflection and memory. The survival of this epic validates the principle that civilization is measured not solely by its material achievements, but by the transmission of thought, knowledge, and narrative insight. In this final reckoning, Gilgamesh achieves a form of immortality that surpasses his original quest. The king's longing for eternal life, initially focused on personal preservation, is realized symbolically through the endurance of the story itself. Scholars, translators, educators, and readers collectively participate in this preservation, ensuring that the lessons, struggles, and reflections of ancient Uruk remain accessible. The epic thus exemplifies the capacity of literature to bridge the temporal gap between human generations, allowing voices from the distant past to converse with the present. Moreover, the epic's continuing relevance illustrates the universality of human inquiry. Mortality, legacy, and ethical responsibility remain central concerns for every society. By engaging with Gilgamesh, modern readers are reminded that questions about life, death, and purpose are neither new nor culturally isolated. They are part of a continuous human dialogue. In this sense, the epic functions as both a historical artifact and a living text, one that informs moral, philosophical, and literary reflection in the 21st century. Ultimately, the Epic of Gilgamesh embodies the enduring dialogue between humanity and its own past. Its rediscovery reconnects modern audiences with the intellectual, emotional, and ethical frameworks of early civilization. The clay tablets may have been silent for centuries, but their words, painstakingly reconstructed, translated, and interpreted, now resonate across cultures, teaching that while mortality is inevitable, the search for understanding, friendship, and creative legacy endures. Through scholarship and engagement, the immortal word of Gilgamesh ensures that civilization continues to remember, reflect, and learn. In this, the first epic achieves the permanence it sought, not through conquest or monumental construction, but through the transmission of human insight across time. The story of Gilgamesh reminds us that the questions of life, death, and human purpose have spanned millennia. To continue exploring the roots of civilization, consider delving into the archaeology of Mesopotamia, reading translations of the epic, or studying comparative literature and mythology. Subscribe for more in-depth explorations of history's earliest stories, and join us as we uncover the narratives that shaped the human journey.